Konnichiwa. Hello, my fellow randoms. My name is Kev Duffy, and welcome to this, our 16th episode of What's Your Random podcast. Well, on our way to 20 episodes within 2020, which was a personal goal of mine. Thank you for your support so far. Thank you for listening, and thank you for sharing your favorite episode if you haven't done so yet to help us broadcast our show to other creatives who may benefit from listening to the conversations I have with fellow creatives. I certainly have benefited greatly already, and I am excited for the remainder of the shows in this pilot season, and also looking forward to our first full season in 2021. If this is your first time to listen in on the show, welcome to What's Your Random, where I discover and celebrate individual and independent creativity from the inception of an idea to the process of bringing it to life. You have an idea. Now, how do you bring that idea into fruition, into being as something that you can share with other people? Sometimes ideas and concepts are hard to articulate. Sometimes it's hard to put into words exactly what you're seeing and imagining. And I think that's one of the reasons and one of the purposes creative mediums serve. And it could be any creative medium. It could be spoken word. It could be storytelling. It could be story writing. It could be any form of illustration and art and fine arts, acting, whatever it may be. We have ideas, and creativity is a way that we express them. So over the course of these last 16 episodes, I've connected with creative people to dig into their ideas, to figure out and try to figure out where their ideas come from, and then to figure out the process that these individuals use to bring that idea to life to share with others. So that, in a growing nutshell, is what I do here at What's Your Random. Thank you for joining us. Without further ado, joining me today by way of Tokyo, Japan, is Matt Moss, a self-described and self-proclaimed drawer. But Matt has many other titles that I'm sure would accurately describe what he does. He's a designer, he's a graphic designer, he's a game designer, he's a brand manager, he works with corporate clients, and he also does art and comics and things to express himself and his own ideas. My interview today with Matt is in large part thanks to an introduction by a previous guest, Luis Santamarina, and these two fine individuals, these two awesome creatives, collaborated on a webtoons comic project called 66 Days, where they kind of journal style documented their experience coming into this new world that we live in under pandemic conditions, from the onset of the pandemic to coming to terms with the restrictions that have been imposed on different sides of the globe, with Matt in Tokyo, Japan, and Luis in Argentina. It's really interesting, it's really personal, and it really captures, I said really a lot there, didn't I? But it really does capture contemporary events from a personal perspective quite well. And if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend you do. Again, that's 66 Days, and it's a comic on webtoons with I think weekly entries. They were shooting for 2 or 3 entries a week to document things as things were unfolding. Matt and I, similar to my conversation with Luis, we dig into the metaphysical, going into abstract ideas about creativity, process, and the society and culture and political situation in which we live, and the cross section of creativity and broader society, broader expectations. It was a really interesting conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. So, without further ado, enjoy a wide-ranging conversation with my guest, Matt Moss. Enjoy the random.
Start running. I'm a strong believer in that, right?
Hit the ground running.
Energy kind of hits real fast sometimes in the beginning with things, so it's good to get it.
Yeah. Well, welcoming to today's episode of What's Your Random Podcast is my guest, Matthew Moss, who is a graphic designer and does graphic design in a variety of spaces, be it video games, web design, comic book artistry. And you could fill in the extra blanks thereafter because I'm sure I'm missing quite a few. Brand development, among many others that we'll get into discussing today. So welcome,
I'm a
Matthew.
drawer.
You're a
I'm
drawer.
really a drawer.
I like that. I love drawing, and more than looking at my own drawings, seeing the skill of others.
Yeah, I think like everybody, there's like, you're either like, there are people who are athletes and there are people who are mathers, but then they're drawers, right? And like, they come in different flavors, but that's kind of, that's at the core of it. Somewhere around 3 years old, mom put you down with crayons and you entertained yourself. And then, 42 years later, you're still doing it.
And is that your origin story? Or are you speaking from experience with having been armed with crayons as a 3-year-old and never putting them down since?
Well, actually, my mom is an artist as well. She's a commercial artist also, and she's a really well-known decorative painter in Miami, Florida. I'm originally from Miami Beach, and she's actually kind of getting on to retirement, the position of retiring, because she's been climbing ladders and painting, in interior design situations. And she's a pretty amazing interior designer in that right as well, and surface designer. So I grew up with like art as a family business, and also her brother was a photographer, and his work, he passed away very young. He was murdered, unfortunately, in kind of crazy time, like in the cocaine cowboys, Scarface kind of era of Miami. But he had recorded life around Miami Beach, especially of like the Yiddish people and what was going on in Miami Beach at that time. And my aunt, my mom's sister, is also a decorative painter. So, art as a legitimate commercial business or enterprise is something that I grew up with, from my earliest day of like, this just what you do, like you figure out how to make money as an artist. Like that's what I learned early on. And sometimes I'm good at it and sometimes I'm not so good at it, but that's part of the life of being an artist.
Yeah. So I know that maybe you can walk us through then having that introduction. That's something that I didn't have growing up. Both my parents worked in the public sector. And so I didn't have that exposure to, hey, you could do art and make a living from it. And I remember, taking AP art classes and in general, not just in terms of art, but I never really thought about the types of jobs that exist out there in the world. And I certainly didn't think that there was an opportunity to do something like graphic design. So I'd be interesting to hear, having been exposed to, you can make a living from art from a young age, what was your progression from crayons in hand to where you are now? And it's been a long road, so take as long as you want to kind of give us your history.
So funny enough, like I think my mother, even though she was a successful artist, she really always had a desire to be in the theater and to be a comedian. So when I was so most of the pictures from when I was really little, I was actually drawing and sitting with crayons and making, with paint, making things and drawing, like specifically drawing, right? But then I think around 7, I was pretty quiet and shy, but I was definitely occupied the fantasy world of like the page, the space on the page, And so because I was very sociable with adults, but not with kids. So my mom actually thought, oh, I should be in the theater and use that imagination and kind of go a different direction with it. And so I spent, maybe 8 or 9 years as a kid in the theater and did a lot of like, theater production, and not just in class. I was in a magnet program, also like an AP program as a junior high school kid for theater, but also in a external like children's theater company and going around and actually performing and doing theater. And it was definitely a great experience in that it taught me a lot of really important skills that are still important, like being able to get up in front of people and kind of being a bit fearless in regard to like showing emotion, And the woman there's another part that was a huge component, which was the woman who was the director of the children's theater program had come from Broadway and returned to Miami. She's from Miami. And she had 3 teenage daughters. And her teenage, this is in the middle 80s. And one of her teenage daughters kind of became a local hip hop celebrity in the 80s from a band that had like a kind of a pop song at the time, and The Trim. And then, and so like that group, like that theater group it was in a part of Miami called Coconut Grove. And it was very mixed, like people from the islands and Black and white and Latino and Jewish, and everybody was all mixed together. And it was very, like now it's become, there's kind of like this woke mentality, but this was like definitely, very open, very supportive, loving community. And at the core of it was really like also 80s hip hop, and so breakdancing, beatboxing, freestyling, like that was something that was introduced to me, and also learning to read music at that time. So, because it was musical theater. So that also started a love of music for me that goes back, and hip hop culture that goes back to that time too. And so that was also very informative for me as a creative person, and like the idea that you don't need much, right, to be creative, like, but also collaboration is extremely important, right? Like, and that art doesn't get made in a bubble, right? Like, it's really important to have like people around that kind of bounce ideas off and get you excited, and kind of you could disagree with and agree with and kind of energize sort of like thinking in that way. So those were really important factors. And some of those people are still my friends to this day, like I don't have a lot of friends from school, but I have friends from that bubble, of my life that are still important people in my life. 2 of my dearest friends are still from that kind of circle of time. So, that was part of my upbringing. But I noticed that as I was in junior high school in the magnet program at the school, where the identity of the theater program was very different than it was in the external, like children's theater group, that I was still spending, even though I'd have to be in rehearsals and whatnot, all my classes, they couldn't get me to do my homework. All I was doing was drawing in my notebook all the time. And like couldn't escape the fact that like the thing that actually I really spent the most time doing was like imagining things and visualizing like, character designs and environments and things like that. Pardon me, it's morning here, so I'm having coffee.
That's okay. Sip your coffee as you need a surge of caffeine.
So, and probably around that time, like junior high school, I got also introduced to like tabletop role-playing games and comic books, and the nerd entryway really was extended, and that's also kind of critical time in life, right? So those things were really important. And I think the other thing that like ties into a lot of my professional work is in the game industry, And I think that also has, so there's two like really important connections there, which is like narrative, the narrative component. So in the theater, there's always like a narrative component. There's a story, right? And a performance. And you got to think about camera angles and body gesture and language, body language. So that's the theater, right? But at the same time, there's also game design. And what is game design, and to be honest, actually, I learned a tremendous amount about game design from tabletop role-playing games, most specifically old school Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like, which has had a huge resurgence over the last 5 or 10 years, right? Like, it's crazy.
Right.
We had to hide our books and, hide the dice, and it was, vilification for being a super nerd, but whatever. And now it's like Hollywood actors are playing Dungeons and Dragons for like podcasts as like a thing to get through COVID, right?
Yeah, it used to be, a life-changing event when you were a middle school student, that it's like a gateway drug. If you decide to play Dungeons and Dragons, it's over. You're going to be an outcast for the rest of your life. Now it's coming full circle, coming into the fold.
Full circle. Everything does, right? So it's interesting how that's happened. But what I learned also from that was, there's in game design, there's the concept of like the XY axis, right? Like every game has an XY axis on some level, right? You're trying to do something is one axis, and then it's either resource management or time management, so that these two axes are interacting, right? So, like take basketball. One of the teams or the other team has to score more points before the time runs out. There's your X and Y axis, points and time, right? So, like even in Dungeons and Dragons, an adventure is kind of like that on some level. There's some kind of resource management. Maybe it's your hit points, right? Before you could get to the end of the adventure session, right? And you might run out and you're dead and that's it. Like you lost the game. So there's this kind of idea and having a mechanics around that, which is like a rule set to kind of experiment and try different things. And then the theater component of characters and characterization and voices and personifications. And then like the character design element of drawing and putting it all together really became kind of like a stew that was informative. That even though as I got into my college years, kind of maybe I didn't play Dungeons and Dragons as much or change things around and got out of the theater, but that basic, those kind of three pillars were extremely critical that like actually in my professional career kind of seem to keep coming around and keep informing like decisions and things that happen. So
yeah, I've never heard, and just because maybe I'm not too involved in game making spaces, but I've never heard of the XY axis described in that way. Is that a common way to talk about those elements in the game developing community?
Yeah,
Or is that,
definitely.
it is.
I think there's a lot of different philosophies in like game development and game design, but like that's really the core. It's two axes. It's two axes.
Your guess is as good as mine.
I've backed myself into a corner with a word that I use fairly often, and now I don't know how to get out. But there's two different axes, and within that, like that interaction is kind of what it's, there's that part, and there's the decision making, right? Like decision making is a big part of the game experience.
And the game also, we call life.
Yeah, right? Amen. So yeah, but there's definitely different philosophies in that regard. And when I was in New York, I was also in New York before I was here in Tokyo. I worked with a pretty well-known game designer, and he was really good at that stuff. And I was the art director, and he was kind of like the creative, the chief creative officer. It was his company, and we worked together, on a day in, day out basis. And it was interesting how much I had taken about, only recently I actually started playing Dungeons and Dragons again. because I had some ideas that I wanted to play out in regard to like game design, not only related to wanting to play Dungeons and Dragons. I just needed a format or a vehicle to be able to do it, and it offered like a system to be able to do that.
Right.
And but during the time that I was in New York, I probably, like there was a time in college, maybe around 2000, and I was in school, and I had like some of my best friends and my roommate, and we were in a band, and we were making music and like funk and hip hop. And like at that time, I really got into the music side of things, and I didn't really have the time, aside from drawing, I didn't really have time for like playing games. I didn't own a TV set. I just had gotten away from that. So, fast forward like a number of years, and then I'm working in New York City, and I still have been away from playing games for 8 years at least. But working in the game design industry, working game development, suddenly all of that was coming back. Like some of those questions and some of that thinking and those things that had been really important at that time, like it came full circle in regard to like the creative process. So yeah, things do, like it became relevant again.
Yeah, they always circle back. So how did you kind of find your way into game making in New York? What was the jump that brought you out of theater and back into game making?
Well, so the jump that brought me out of theater, so there's two different points of time, but we could kind of swing it full circle. What brought me out of theater was that I had to make a decision, and there was a huge hurricane in Miami, and our house was destroyed. I had to go to a different high school, and this goes back to 92, 92. And I had to make a choice, and I'd been kicked out of high school. I was a bad kid. And, and I went to a high school that was really, after junior high school, I went to a high school that was really focused on like test scores and all this kind of stuff. And it was my local school. And I just did not fit into that type of thinking. Like you couldn't sit me down at a Scantron and fill out Scantron bubbles. Like I just absolutely was like, it was ridiculous to me at the time. And I kind of revolted from that, kind of like being forced fed into that and being forced to study for tests, and it just didn't make any sense to me, and I was terribly frustrated. So I got kicked out of school, which was fine. And then there was a hurricane, and I had to move to my grandparents' house and enroll in a different school. And I was very fortunate that at that time, because of the chaos and the school system's records were not all computerized as they are now, it kind of gave me a bit of a clean slate. And
so the hurricane wiped out records of.
I mean, it wiped out more than records, but it definitely wiped out some records. Yes. And the school system was in chaos at the time. I mean, it was a big storm. And I went to the school at that time, which was Miami Beach Senior High School, which was the next closest school, like to my grandparents' house. And, I had to go with like the other hurricane refugee kids to go prior to like school being even reopened, because the school year had started late. And there was, I was being interviewed by the school counselor as to where I thought I needed to be, and they're trying to discern like what I should be doing. So they had me go and meet the art teacher at the school, because my mother's an artist and she's well known in Miami Beach, and so and the people at the school know my mom, because Miami Beach is not that big a community. So they said, oh well, you should go talk to Judith Frager. She was the art teacher, and see where you fit in. And then thankfully, she kind of sized me up a little bit, and she was a sharp lady. And she was like, all right, you could be in the AP class. And it was for me, it was a really fortunate experience. And I was still terrible at school, but I would cut out like the beach is 2 blocks away from Miami Beach Senior High School, right? Like, literally, not a joke. It's like within 100 yards to the ocean. So I learned all the ways to sneak out of the school and get to the beach. However, I would definitely be there for the 2 hours a day that were like art, the art time of my art lessons, my AP art classes. And so that's really how I transitioned hard into like, I didn't want to be doing anything else. I just wanted to be like drawing all the time. That was what was important. So, yeah. So then in regard to that, like that kind of led me, and I got real serious about it. Even though I was a terrible high school student, I ended up teaching elementary school after that for a year. I went in to help the kids paint a mural. The school had contacted my mother, the elementary school in Miami Beach and South Beach, had contacted my mother to come paint a mural, and she was too busy. She referred them to me because I was a 18-year-old with nothing going on except for sitting around drawing all the time. And so I went into the school, and they wanted me to like meet the kids and see if I would be, appropriate to work with kids and help them paint a mural. And after a couple of days of working with the kids and planning out the mural, they said, well, it was like a Tesseract school, like a special kind of, before there were, what do they call them now? Like magnet schools? Not magnet
charter
schools,
or magnet.
Yeah, the way that they do
Charter.
it, like the system's totally changed since, the early 90s. But they had additional funding. There was budget that was not afforded to a regular elementary school. And they said, we have enough budget for an additional non-instructional staff member in the art classroom. If you'd like to, like, we love having you here and the kids really respond to you. And so for me, that was really actually my best experience in secondary education. Not as a student, but as a teacher.
Yeah.
And like in teaching something that I love and seeing how the kids responded, like kids like were so, and how impressionable they were. And at the time, like, I had like my sketchbook with me all times. And my sketchbook was, I was 18 years old, and I'd been assembling like a collage of like hip hop posters and covers and magazines, and would cut out like bits and pieces of things and kind of make like assemblages and collages of artists that I liked and imagery that was important to me at the time. And then I would notice like the kids would come to me and they would say like, oh, we like that Onyx album. Like when I remember, and I remember being like 18 years old and remembering that like there's a song on there like Black Vagina Finder. And I was like, wait, I felt like this horrible sense of responsibility in the moment. Like, geez.
Maybe you shouldn't be listening to that. That's a pretty core indie, like indie hip hop group, right?
Yeah, from that time. And I felt like terribly responsible, but it was great. It like really taught and explaining to kids like how to kind of loosen up what they're trying to do and express themselves. And so that really taught me like a different approach to education and how I was being educated and how I wanted to be, go back to school at some point in time. And from there, basically, I went back to community college and I got a job working as the gopher in the art department at the Miami Daily Business Review. This is a newspaper for business in Miami. And saw the cut and paste up projects, and at that time it was like Quark Express was like it was in its introductory phase, and there were still guys who were typesetting and using like hot wax press and rollers to cut and paste newspaper together. So like that was really my introduction to typography and typesetting in regard to graphic design. And I would be going to like figure drawing classes and model studio, and then balancing that out with like working in the newsroom and filing photography and art and learning kind of the ropes in cut and paste and putting newspaper together. And then that led me to like my next college experience. I went to the Joe Kubert School, like the famous school for cartoon illustration and animation.
Where is that at?
In New Jersey. And it's really like one of the few dedicated places to the study of cartoon illustration and animation. And I got to make a lot of connections with the old timers and really focusing on narrative storytelling as a craft and drawing. And then from there, I went to Memphis College of Art because I ended up wanting, that was a technical school, and I wanted a BFA. So I went to Memphis to finish up and get a degree in illustration and visual communication. And while I was there, went back to the newspaper world and got my first job as a syndicated editorial cartoonist. So that's really where it took the leap from working in-house to being kind of having a voice. And then I worked in syndicating editorial cartoons for a number of years, but I could see that the writing was on the wall, that, that industry was definitely not going to stick around the way that, newspapers were just, the writing was on the wall. And Craigslist was eating up all the classified, the money that was going to classified ads, which really supports quite a bit of publication costs and, the in and out costs of operating a newspaper. So when I was at my second paper, which was actually a pretty big paper in Florida and growing, the only paper that was growing in Florida at the time, I knew, though, that I had to go into a different industry. And that's when I thought, what can I do? And games seemed to make a lot of sense.
Interesting. I'll let you sip your coffee and I'll ask kind of a question in between.
So
I wonder.
There's two circles. You asked two questions that were not related, but I tried to weave it into one narrative.
I often do that, and you killed with your response. And I'm curious, you mentioned interacting with some old timers that were using techniques in typesetting and graphic design that were quickly becoming antiquated. And were you, I'm sure you could learn a lot by knowing how to do the old way, and that could inform a lot of your strategies for design, even applying them to use of new technologies. But in regards to new technologies, were you learning about the software that was emerging at the time? Were you already engaging and teaching yourself how to use those programs like the Adobe suites and whatnot?
Yeah, there was no Adobe suite, right? Those were all independent, separate applications at that point in time.
And separate companies, I think, right?
Well, prior to Macromedia, remember, like, Macromedia was Flash, and that was like a whole separate. And like,
right, yeah.
Dreamweaver, was it not Dreamweaver? Well, Dreamweaver was Macromedia, and then also Fireworks. What was the? There was a Fire something like that was really for prepping graphics for the web at that time, right?
Right, and they had when they did acquire all these smaller companies and acquire even larger companies that had a diverse portfolio, there was a lot of redundancy in their portfolio of programs. But that takes me back to a time of design and software that I haven't thought about in a long time.
That's like generations of software ago, like so far back that, like, we forget that was a thing. Fireworks? What was it?
I think it was Fireworks. I never used it, but I remember it being part of the suite.
That's when the PNG file format really started to catch on, right? Which, like, still to this day, like, man, I'd be dead without the PNG file format. What would I do without the PNG file format?
So were you teaching yourself about these programs and trying to build an awareness and ability to use them? Because it's difficult to jump right into a program and know how to use it automatically.
Absolutely.
And at that time, the interfaces of the programs were developing very quickly. So I'm curious if you were dabbling in those while you were also working with more manual techniques, or if there was a little bit of a lag when you jumped in.
Well, there was some kind of lag, but it was because of the necessities and the technological hurdles at the time, but not because of a lack of interest. Actually, my mother, I have to give her a lot of credit in one thing specifically in this regard, was that even though still to this day, she somehow has this weird ability to both be brilliant at, like, some aspects of social networking and at the same time not understand how to use a computer at all. But she was always an early adapter of technology. So like when there was brick phones, she had a brick phone on the job site to be managing projects, right? And when we were kids, like we definitely always had a computer and somehow had like creative software to be able to do stuff, and like and she never, that was one thing that we didn't, even if she didn't know how to use it, she had a computer and would try to do her taxes or use it for organizing photography, or like even if she wasn't good with it, like it was always, I think somehow she saw the benefit of that. Was like, there's a evolution that's like you can't turn away from unless you want to be a Luddite.
Right.
And look, what I just saw, like somebody posted something on one of the social platforms, like Christopher Walken's never owned a computer or sent an email, right? Like, I'm not against being a Luddite if you can do it. Like if you want to be that person, like if you're Christopher Walken, yeah, like, like that's great. Like more power to him,
But I mean, that's selectively looking at the technology he did not use and not acknowledging the technology he did use, to
absolutely.
survive in his daily life. And
Absolutely.
also, he didn't need technology, the internet or whatever, but I'm sure he used a calculator. You know what I mean? Like he used
Not
what
to,
he needed to use to do what he was doing. And
right. And his family is a family of bakers from Astoria, Queens. Did you know that?
I did not know that. No.
Yeah, and he's like he grew up in song and dance in Queens, and would like be a supporting person on Broadway shows, and would go work in his father's bakery. And kind of I love Walken, not just because of like his the character of Christopher Walken, but he's a very interesting dude. But not to mention that all of the films that he's been in for the last 20 years needed a ton of digital technology to edit and color grade and all of the distribution channels and platforms that completely rely on digital technology that he might himself not have used, but certainly were employed to his benefit,
Right.
So I mean, however, whatever, people could do whatever they need to. But when I was at the Joe Kubert School, that was in 96, 97, 97, 98, somewhere around there. And there was one computer in the entire school. And I had already been working at the business paper in Miami. So when I got there and saw that like we're using a photostat, you know what a photostat machine is?
Yeah. Isn't it
Right?
essentially like a fax machine or a copy machine?
No. A photostat machine is how you transfer drawings to film, and that you would have to cut different different pieces of filter to filter out certain areas of the color spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so you would cut like amberlith and rubylith, like these were like red and yellow screens, and you would cut them around the image, parts of the image that you want to be blocked from the negative, right? And there, I mean, this is like when you needed still also like the reason why people draw, why people do all their underdrawing in like that kind of turquoisey blue was, because the photocopy machines were specifically designed not to pick up that blue color, right?
Right.
So when you're doing underdrawing, that you might be doing thumbnails at 8x11 and you want to blow them up to 14x17, if you have a copier that can do that, you could do your underdrawing all in blue. And then when you blow up, when you do your roughs in pencil, you can then blow it up from, 8.5x11 to 14x17. And all your messy, nasty underdrawing is gone, right? Like completely gone. That's also why, in the old Dungeons and Dragons books, the maps pages were always done in that kind of non-photo reproducible blue, because they were losing a ton of money from people photocopying and distributing their books. So if you didn't have the maps, right, you couldn't really play the modules the same way, right? So they would print the modules and certain key parts of the books in that blue, cyan blue color.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
yeah. It's like old photos, really old graphic design technology, right? So there's something to be learned there for sure. And like still to this day, man, I love like especially mid-century, like 1960s, 1970s, print production styles, like the way that the designers started to be able to manipulate those tools to create art is very relevant or relative, like similar to what's going on over the last 20 years with how like the digital tools have become that, right? So like, I think we see, okay, here's a philosophical thing. I think we see, especially with anime and in comics, there's a lot of tricks and tricknology in making beautiful images, and it's totally okay. But underneath it, I think that there's a lot of people that don't necessarily have such profound drawing skills as they appear to have, right? But they're able to employ the tools in a way that is extremely effective, right? And I'm not knocking that. If you can figure out, like that's the part about being a commercial artist. If you can figure out how to do something, then do it and make your money, and that's fine.
Right.
But it doesn't
It's
necessarily.
finding efficiencies
Absolutely.
as delivering a product, but when you're finding these efficiencies and you're just focused on delivering the product with efficiencies so that you can make more money and spend less time actually investing time into that product, where does it become less of an art and more of a commodity? And I'm relatively big anime fan, and
Mhm.
a lot of anime I cannot watch because of the lack of art. I would say. So
Oh, absolutely.
I wonder if you could expound upon that or expand upon that and give like a specific example of what you're referring to as it pertains to anime.
Sure. So, in regard to anime, right? I think right now, here's one part of the skill of drawing that's important. If you can understand how to render, well, let's talk about manga for a second, before, like as opposed to anime. Although there's like obviously some direct connection because well, here's one part that's the direct connection. Miyazaki said like recently 5 years ago, 6 years ago already, but that the Japanese studios were dying, not because that they're not making stuff, but because artistically they're dying, because they all make work that looks exactly the same,
Right.
right? So like, I think that there's a lot of truth to that. I think Marvel and DC have the same problem too, right?
Well,
Like,
I would say specifically about Japanese anime, like or anime, a lot of anime I see out there, I can't differentiate it from what would be a simulator on like
right.
a relationship simulator or one of these games where you're role playing and basically characters just pop up in front of you, talk, and like a choose your own adventure story. You make a selection of three options and it effectively turns you to the next page in that adventure game. And when I watch anime, a lot of times now it's just like I can't even like I can't differentiate this from one of those games, and I've never even played one of those games.
Yeah, and that's kind of similar to what Miyazaki said, right? Which is like there's a shorthand, like girls look this way, right? And backgrounds look this way, and effects act this way. And the shorthand has become such a crutch that no one is inventing new ways. However, the technology is advancing, right? So there's more ways to compile it, there's more ways to make it look polished, there's more ways to put texture on it, there's more ways to animate it. But that doesn't mean that the core skills are being invested in.
Right.
Like the core drawing skills are not being invested in. Now, that doesn't also mean it's like the same thing. Like, I think it's hard today in a similar fashion to find really good new music, right?
Mm.
Like, because you used to be able to go to like the record store, there was a place that you go, and there's like the dude that works at the record store, and like he would tell you what's coming, and maybe you could like get to sample a couple of different things, and the
Well, also
way
you could go to the punk section and thumb through, and it wouldn't be sorted by an algorithm. It would be sorted alphabetically or
right,
something along those lines. And
absolutely,
like I picked up a album like Guitar Wolf, which is a Japanese punk band from back in the day, that way. And I encountered a lot of good punk music and random Peanut Butter Wolf, who I just
yeah,
remembered and started listening to on Spotify because I had bought that album in uh, Coconuts, or one of the it's a throwback, right? One of the CD stores. Oh man, I never thought saying this stuff would make me feel old, right? One of the CD stores back in the day, I was thumbing through a genre, and it's not like I thought it would be easier or better now with technology, but I think what they perceive as the cream seems to always rise to the top, and it blurs my ability to really dig into the bottom of the pile and turn up something that might be a gem for me, but not necessarily the masses.
yeah. And there's a lowest common denominator factor that like is trying to be accommodated for at all times, right? And I think that that's where, like, between the algorithm and the lowest common denominator factors, like, that's where, like, we lose the ability to, like, stumble upon Peanut Butter Wolf, like, thinking that it's going to be one thing. And then you get it, and then you listen to it, and maybe you don't have, like, now you could jump to 50 different things on YouTube within 10 seconds. Whereas then, like 20 years ago, you get that Peanut Butter Wolf album, and you listen to it at first, you're like, I don't know if I dig this. And then you're like, well, I bought it, and then you listen to it again. The second time you're like, And then a third time, maybe you give it a third try. And the third time you're like, I never
See what
thought I
they're
liked
doing
this kind
here.
of music, right? But because you're like, there's a bit of your choice, the limitation in choice also gives you an opportunity to digest things in a different
I
way.
like that. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
We all suffer from like such an immense like a decision making process all the time. Like now that I think that's part of the reason that between that and these like algorithms in determining what's on your news feed or what's in your social media feeds and what comes up on YouTube. That's where this kind of like fractured, polarized tribalism that we're seeing in society gets like kind of fed, sort of like
Right.
this junk food, in like this junk food sort of nutritional information system that we kind of get stuck with.
Yeah. I'd like to take it one layer deep, as you were saying that, I thought one layer deeper, because as you were saying that, I thought about it. And maybe it's not necessarily like, I hate always blaming the technology. It's just that I think we rely on the technology to make certain easy to make decisions for us. And
Sure.
when they're not, let me rewind a little bit. Back in the day, I used to have to drive to Coconuts. I used to have $20 back in the day is probably like $50 now to buy a freaking CD. And I had to really determine which CD I was going to spend that hard earned cash on.
Yeah,
And that decision was hard. And
that's a hard decision, man.
you had to flip through albums and take your time to make that decision, right? So there was a lot of time invested in digging into the bins of CDs and looking through what you might want. Now, I think you could do something similar if you are willing to invest the time in digging past the algorithm into these caves, going on to Bandcamp and going down a rabbit hole to try to find something that might pique your interest that wouldn't have been fed to you by the algorithm. But the algorithm's so damn convenient, we want it to give it the deeper stuff to us without having to dig. So I guess I kind of see it from both angles. Like,
Yeah, there's a good side. Look, there's a great side. There's some really wonderful stuff too. Like, um, man, like there's so much awesome content immediately available. Like amazing stuff. Like I'm a history nerd. So like, man, I could watch all kinds of cool ancient history stuff on YouTube. And like and find interesting podcasts and all kinds of there's all kinds of immediately available stuff, right? That like I'm grateful for, and there's there's no that we can't go back, but there is the part that I think that we do lose in the algorithm, in allowing algorithms to determine so much, which is like guides and the dude at the record store and the comic book guy and your friend's older brother who was also playing role-playing games, who was like, oh, if you like Star Wars, you might like Mech Warrior, and then you like, holy shit, whoa, this is
where
big
did this
too,
come from? Yeah, that's a good point.
Those people were kind of replaced by, like, now I think they're getting kind of replaced by like influencers, and like there's nothing personal there, right? Like, and they're the skin that they have in the game is to the brand that's maybe giving them a little bit of cheese for what they're doing. And
that's a good point.
Not to just being like, oh yeah, you like that, yeah, you like this J-pop band from 1970, and check out like these guys from like Argentina, or like some kind of weird thing that you never would have, like an algorithm is never going to give you, and somebody who isn't making money off of it isn't trying to influence your opinion. Like, they're just the people that kind of
and their opinion and their experience and their fingerprint as an individual on that recommendation is lost when the algorithm, which is kind of ubiquitous and created by a select few people, chooses for you. Yeah.
And it's immediate, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And like there are, that's why I think there's a lot of people talking about like the value of the curator in society now. Like, that's what the curator is on some level too, right? Like,
yeah. It's interesting. This is a point that comes up in a lot of these conversations I've had. If I'm counting correctly, you're my 16th guest, I think. And over the course of these 15 conversations so far, a lot of times it comes up that, hey, a personal connection with somebody is actually really important. And meeting people in person is actually really important for not just community, but actually for various creative processes. And it's cool to look at it through the lens of also curation and getting recommendations, being introduced to new media that you may not have otherwise been introduced to. Because if it's just the algorithm recommending it to, you could like talk to everyone about it, because maybe, the majority of people who you communicate with are being recommended the same thing. But you could have a much deeper and much more interesting conversation if it's something a little bit more specific, a little bit more tuned to, a smaller group of your friends. That, the mech, I forgot what it was, Mech Warriors or whatever was recommended to you back in the day. There's interesting, like, sometimes I have trouble in my own mind because I tend to see things from too many perspectives and give validity to all of them. And so right now in this conversation, it's like, oh, wow, this is an interesting spin on it. This is an interesting spin on it.
There's an art also, I think, to being able to connect the dots, right? Like being able to present connections to somebody, I think, is an art in its own right. Like, did you ever watch James Burke? Do you know who James Burke is?
No.
Oh man. Write it down.
I'm going to Google, start telling us, and I'm going to see if I know his face, because I'm a facial recognition.
He might have passed away. He might still be alive. He's got to be in his late 80s or 90s now. And he was a BBC documentary guy. And he did a bunch of different shows. One of them was called Connections, and another one was called The Day the Universe Changed. And there's still people that are like really devotees of this guy. But he would present these kind of like documentary like TV shows that he would take two things that would be seemingly unrelated in history and be able to relate how certain philosophies and scientific advancements and different people who are seemingly unconnected get you from point A to point B. And he was always able to do it with such a such a profound nature that along the journey of doing it, you yourself feel as if you've been enlightened somehow, you know? And the first few series are absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
And I should say it's spelt for anybody listening, Burke, James
Yeah,
Burke.
James Burke.
And
Burke.
so is it about like something like cultural resonance across the globe, that two cultures found something similar at the same time in history without having had communication together? Is
That
it something like
happens,
that?
or often things like, how does the spice route, the spice roads in the 15th century lead to hypersonic space travel, hypersonic air travel,
So kind of
right?
like a
Butterfly effect.
the butterfly effect.
There's that part, and there's the part of like how inspiration in one place can then affect inspiration in another field, you know, like from field, like how things can kind of jump channels but still kind of have a reverberation in two different areas, and how that affects history. Yeah, fascinating stuff, like really super well framed, you know, like it's kind of curating history and putting the points together that show sort of evolution.
Yeah, cultural and social and
Yeah,
societal.
yeah,
all
fascinating
of
stuff.
all of those words. Very cool. So going back to your foray into video gaming, so
Mhm.
you were working in these various newspapers. You went to the school for animation up in New Jersey. And then was it from there directly that you went to New York and made that leap?
Yeah, pretty much. Once I was at a paper in, you know, for a while in Central Florida, and I knew I needed to get out of there. And pardon I have a kitten in the other room, and he's getting a little hyper.
A kitten?
Yeah, well, he's 7 months old, and
uh,
he's adorable, but he needs a lot of attention. So if you hear him, I apologize.
and if you need to tend to him, we could always take 5 too. So let me know.
Yeah, I think he's all right. He gets a little noisy sometimes, but so I knew that I need. Well, I was actually I was working at a paper, and at the time I'm definitely what would be classified as a classic liberal, you know, in regard to like my opinions and my viewpoints politically, and the paper served primarily, you know, Central Florida, so the people reading it are retirees mostly, you know, and that's exactly who it's serving, and it was serving like the largest, specifically largest retiree community in the world, right? So, and it was also during the Iraq War, you know, during W's administration, and I had been at a very liberal newspaper in Memphis, and I needed a job, and they offered me a job, and I had to kind of work out myself how I was going to negotiate serving an audience and at the same time not contradicting my own values as an editorialist. And I was able to do that by looking at the linguistics of things, you know, and make jokes around the language without stepping too deep into political viewpoints.
So basically, avoiding getting too specific and kind of walking around an issue and maybe having some innuendo that could be interpreted multiple ways. Or it sounds like you
Well, yeah,
were really wordsmithing.
wordsmithing, and then like looking at like, you know, I was trying to use I was always really impressed. I always really loved like George Carlin as like a linguist, not just as a
Yeah.
comedian, but as a linguist, right? Looking at the language. And then like how he could like take the words and then like, let's look at these words from a different direction, you know? And there were a ton of them. I'm trying to remember them now because like it's already quite a long time ago. But you know, like turning that around and applying some of the phrases and things that would be being tossed around by W and his the people in his administration and in the news media at the time, and then applying that to the fact that like most of my audience is retirees. So how could I make jokes about old married couples, but use the language that's being applied to like, you know, weapons of mass destruction and war in Iraq and, you know, like these kinds of things, like just totally taking it out of the context of the politics and putting it into the personal, you know, and into relationship, you know, and other stuff. So just going 180 degrees with it, and still allowing the absurdity of the linguistics to be part, but without it being like, hey, George W. Bush is a very embarrassing president, you know, like at that time. Because I, you know, and literally like W would show up in that community often. You know, like he would, so the guy who owned the paper, like let the Bushes use his airplane, and Jeb was the governor of the state of Florida at the time. So like, I mean, there were direct interactions there that,
So did you ever get your wrist slapped for any perceived, you know, you were walking a pretty thin tightrope, and it might have even been a loose tightrope that you could easily fall off of. And I wonder if you were ever slapped on the wrist for offending anybody who had different sensibilities.
Well, so, you know, there's a kind of a hierarchy of like the publisher pays my bills. And so I don't necessarily want to like, I kind of learned quickly how to negotiate that area, right? Like, I don't want to stick my neck out too far, but I felt like that still afforded me enough space. It was on me to be creative into how I reinterpret things.
Right.
You know?
And sometimes you could find humor in discomfort. And so, you know,
Sure.
if you're able to capitalize on that aspect of, you know, your own discomfort, maybe with the paper that you were working at, and then the discomfort that the readership might have with your own personal views as a illustrator and artist and writer there. You
And
can manipulate that in a certain way, right?
there's nothing as kind of gratifying as also getting like a letter, like a handwritten letter that's like, you're an asshole for like this joke, you know? Like,
Is that
okay,
what's framed on the wall behind you?
okay. I made you have to sit down and write a letter and put a stamp on it and put it in the post office, put it in the post box and have the post office send it to me. You know, like those were kind of I knew if I struck that much of a chord, then obviously like I was doing something not so bad, you know. They might not have agreed, but that was okay. And then there were other times. Actually, there was a conflict between the owner of the newspaper and the county commission in one of the counties that they served, and I was asked to do some. I was asked to go to the county commission meetings that were open to the public, and to kind of observe the two head politicians in those counties, and then use that to draw cartoons about what these guys, because they were kind of bad. They were bad stereotypes as well of like bumbling country politicians, you know, and like and sort of patriarchal, like bad patriarchal archetypes, and very easy to kind of lampoon, quite frankly,
and make a caricature.
Oh yeah, and I would show up in the assembly, in the meeting hall assembly in their county seat, and with my sketchbook in hand, sitting in the back and drawing. And so they knew exactly who I was, you know. And when the cartoon showed up in the newspaper, they knew exactly who did it, right? So I was warned various times not to get pulled over because there's lots of cops on country roads, you know, like don't get pulled over in Sumter County. Like, just don't get stopped in Sumter County. Like, you could be in trouble.
Yeah.
So there was that part too, which was kind of funny in its own right. But it made I got a little burnt out of the newspaper environment, not because of not because of the newsroom, not because of making cartoons, but because I love the job of it. The job was great because the other part of it is this: when you're doing it daily, you do a bad one, and the next day you get up and you make a new one, and the next day you wake up and you make a new one, and like you figure out what you did wrong, and if the file's printed too dark, you figure out how you tweak the plates a little bit for the printer, and there's like the technical stuff that's enjoyable, and there's the making a joke that's enjoyable, and there's having an editor every day. Having an editor is wonderful. Like, man, I wish I had an editor now. Like, if every day I had something I had to go show somebody and talk to about, and like that person had to help me kind of like get it and whip it into shape. Man, wow, I love that. Like, that's so valuable. Jeez, that was valuable.
Yeah, you're able to pass off at least part of the responsibility and get validation and
Yeah,
confirmation that, okay, all your writing is right, your grammar's all right, this looks okay, there's no mess ups here
yeah.
or there, right?
Well, like this drawing doesn't make sense to me, and then you got to be like,
Were
I
you
thought it
doing
was perfect.
single panel or multiple panels on a daily
No, those
basis?
were single panel. I mean,
Okay.
I did do strips too, but no, I was primarily doing single panel, like political editorial cartoons. And but the newsroom itself, like the company itself, was kind of more difficult than the actual responsibility of the job, and the community was difficult. Being like like the Bush years were wearing on, and um, like I was kind of, even though I kind of kept a low profile, I was still kind of like the oddball, and there weren't, like, coming from Miami, growing up in international, like international environments, and there just wasn't. I would have to drive like an hour to Orlando or to Tampa to find somewhere to go hang out. And
So how long were you there in that situation?
for like 3 years or something.
Wow, yeah, you held on for a while. So I
Yeah,
mean, considering the environment and the limitations, I guess that speaks to you actually really enjoying the work
I
itself.
loved the work. I loved getting up
Yeah.
and like going in the newsroom, my desk was next to the investigative reporter, and I would go and help him on stories sometimes, like just to help him do a little gumshoeing. Like I used to love to, like, I would try to get a day or two ahead on comic strips, on panels, and then kind of like, if he needed something, hey, he's going up to the Ocala National Forest to do a story, and can I go with him and take some photos, and like, let's go, and
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
that kind
Oh
of
man. That
going
sounds
out.
very. It sounds very episodic, like your life
Oh yeah,
there. Yeah,
oh,
every day is a new
absolutely.
adventure. Not only a new comic, but a new adventure.
So like that part was great, but like the paper and the internal politics of the corporation stuff was kind of difficult. So that was when, and I had a family member who got sick back in Miami, and I kind of wanted to go. It was my grandfather. I was very close with him. I lived in his house, and we were very tight. And I kind of wanted to go down and spend some time with him, and somehow that ended up being the end of my time at the newspaper. Even though I had just won a national press award, it still ended up being the end of my time at the newspaper. And
You're like,
so,
let's end on a high note.
yeah. And so then I decided, like, okay, I got to switch it up. And I wanted to really make 2D casual games. And that led me to New York.
Cool.
You
So
know,
2D casual, is that like Flash? What system? What audience? What
yeah.
type of game?
So like, you remember Real Player?
No.
Real Player was like real
Oh
media,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. Vaguely.
I know. It's been a
I'm
long
gonna
time.
have to pull up a YouTube video of what it looked like, and then it'll really
It's a
be
long
like a
time ago.
flashback.
So these would be games that now you would play. Now you have a mobile device, but at that time nobody had a mobile device, right? Um, and they would be downloadable games. And here's a big one in that category. A lot of them are puzzle based, not necessarily a lot of platformers, but based on old school game mechanics. So games like
Like
Puzzle,
Jewel Thief.
yeah,
Jewel.
and Bejeweled,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? Um, and my old boss, the game designer who I worked with had created the game Diner Dash. That was a big one,
Okay.
right? So games like that. So games that have very clear mechanics, that are very inclusive. So it doesn't matter whether you're a man, woman, what age,
Right.
generally
They
nonviolent,
were so generic and simple,
generic, right?
right?
No, to me, like the non-violent thing was really big. I didn't want to make games where anyone's getting shot. Like I was really, really dead set on that. Um, and a lot of them were built on platforms that like underneath were like all just some kind of like C++, basic, straightforward, stuff. Uh, and so I basically just like jumped right into it. Like I found a company that needed an art director, and they were using Flash to start developing games for the web at that point in time. And they would produce like a package of games for media outlets. So for example, I did a package of games for National Lampoon, the magazine. And so like we would have games like, whack-a-mole and very basic, straightforward games that everyone knows the mechanics of. Sudoku or word, like any kind of like simple word games, catapult games, like you got a catapult and how, so that becomes like, it would be reskinned for the client. So, the
Right.
catapult game becomes like beer pong for National Lampoon, right? And all of that kind of stuff. And then so like what that did was that really gave me an entry point to both how to handle a client's brand, how to think about that for the client, how to provide something for clients that were, like recognized entities, and then how to translate that into 2D animated interactive environment. And that was really my entry point into making games and also into working with um, well-known entities and also being in the New York business space. Um, and it was a lot of fun. And there are a lot of things like all the terrible things you hear about like working in the game industry are absolutely true. Like, not the easiest industry. However, it's extremely creative. Um, and it
Do you think
requires,
that the devilish and evil things about the game industry, do you think they were as bad then as they are now? Do you think that things have
I'm sure,
escalated and accelerated, or?
I don't know. Like I have a very different perspective, probably living in Tokyo now for 8 years, where Japan is not known for its quality of work-life balance. So, so like coming from the game industry in New York City, where there's not a lot of work-life balance, to being in Tokyo, where there's not a lot of work-life balance, hearing other people like complain about work-life balance issues, I don't know anymore.
You're for yeah, yeah. No, yeah, I could appreciate that.
I don't know. Um, I
Was
know I what
I was just going to ask if there was any difficulty with the transition from newspaper to video games. So, I mean, I introduced you into this episode as a designer, and you said that you're a drawer, but I mean, it takes a heck of a lot more knowledge and tools in your toolbox to be able to make such a transition. I mean, talking about the code, the overall design and functioning of the game, understanding those, which could translate over to brands. So, to give you a little bit more credit than you gave yourself, you're not just a drawer. You've been in such wide range of different design spaces. And in your transition between those spaces, I wonder if there was any shock or lag in your ability to put your foot on the gas once you transitioned from, the newsroom to the game developing room.
Well, okay, to be fair, there's always transition, right? Like no matter, there's always transition in some way. And that's always important to kind of figure it out, right? To feel it out and to not get too scared. And again, that's a place where working in teams and working with other people and having people that you trust around you make it something that's not a fear, like something to fear, right?
Right.
I think the only times I ever really feared something were not living up to the expectations or the desire, like not being able to make somebody happy, not being able to make like my teammates or a client happy. But like in to answer your question, like I think to go back to it and to like in the context of this conversation, like I didn't know anything about a photostat machine when I went to the Joe Kubert School. I didn't know anything about how to do cut and paste the old-fashioned way when I went to work at the newspaper in Miami. I didn't know anything about interior painting except for like what my mother taught me. I didn't know anything, so there's always process, right? There's always process. And the variance between being an artist, like an illustrator and a drawer and painter, and being a designer is your relationship to the process, right? So in the initial states, it's always additive, right? You're drawing more lines, you're building up on something, right? You're trying to figure out the process. You're trying to engineer a process out of something, right? And then in preparing it for the client or for market, that's where the designer comes in and starts to take away the unnecessary parts and pieces and get down to the real core of what's going on, right? And so there's a real interplay between the two parts and the two jobs. So like, if you ask me, I mean, graphic designer is fine, commercial artist is fine, illustrator is fine, art director is fine. All of those things apply to what I am as a creative. However, I really think that at the baseline, there's the additive and the subtractive nature of first conceptualizing and throwing everything out, and then starting to peel back away until you get a clearer focus by removing things, right? And the harder part I find as my career continues, and I still got a lot of years, man, I'm not even nearly ready to call anything quits, right? The part that I find the bigger challenge as time goes on isn't the evolution of technology. It's sitting down in the initial phases and not letting the designer take control and not letting the artist take control. That either side of the brain.
But having a negotiation between the two.
That actually being a writer is the important part at the initial phase. And that you got to write out what the concept is, and you got to boil that part out first, right? And then while you're doing that, that might include different parts and pieces, right? Like being the writer might mean that you're sketching ideas constantly. Being the writer might mean that you actually like sit and write it down. But at some point in time, a project, an idea, a concept needs to be put into a brief, needs to be put into a document, right? And
fleshed out a little bit.
And needs to be defined, right? Like, and some people, there's some creatives that are genius at this, and they don't need the actual step of doing it. I'm not one of them, right? And I think like when you work with other people, you can't do it all internally, right? Some people, and there are wonderful artists and creatives who do it all internally, and good for them. Like, I'm not knocking that. But I think like when you're working with other people, when you're doing projects for clients, when you have an idea for something, like right now I want to make my own source book, like game source book for something, right? Like that's like my little personal project. I'm spending time considering like visually what I want that to look like, and I'm thinking about as a game designer how I want that to be. But it's really not going to get any traction until it's spelled out on a paper. This is what it is, defined, right?
Right. That's
Um,
you're coming to another point that has come up multiple times over the course of my conversations, my last 15
which is
conversations, which is that sometimes the best thing you could have as a creative is boundaries. And I
oh
think
yeah,
the definition of what you're doing in a way creates a boundaries, because if you say, all right, this story is going to take place in the ocean, and you start writing about outer space, you've drifted outside of your lane, and you know that you wouldn't even get to that point, right? Because you have those lanes so well defined. And yeah, it's a point that has not been lost on me and has been resonating over the course of my conversations. But it hasn't been defined in the way that you're describing it, which is defining what you're doing and creating a
yeah.
definition and writing a short piece to describe the project.
So okay, two things. Um, this weekend, one of my oldest friends, one of the people from my, being in theater when I was a kid, he's got a special effects. He had a special effects studio that he sold just prior to COVID in LA, and he's been extremely successful. He's an extremely talented filmmaker, and now he's working completely independently. And I was just talking to him, and he was asking for tips because he's starting to draw his own storyboards. And he was asking me like, how should he approach doing storyboards? And how should he approach drawing for storyboards? And I said, first thing, get one color pencil, one number 2 pencil, and a gray marker, big fat gray marker, right? And I was like, and then just only worry about how you would think about those frames being shot from your eye and the gesture in those frames. And the color pencil is for gesturing it out. Don't put too many lines. The line work is all only with that number 2 pencil, and that gray marker is for shading. And don't go outside those 3 things. Let everything happen like you're looking at it through the camera, and let those 3 tools be your guiding points for how you're informing the decisions that you're making for your storyboards and for how you're telling the story. Keep within those limitations, right? Like, because if you use all the tools, man, I got Photoshop, I got 2 different Wacom tablets right here. I got 50 different brushes. I've got dip pens, technical pens, all this kind of stuff. I have just a treasure trove of materials for which to be creative with,
And
immediately available.
if you can't decide which one to use, you're never going to start your project.
And right, and like even I love I really have been using Procreate a lot as my sketchbook. I absolutely adore it. But like the same thing, like I have to do the same thing. I make 3 different tools or 4 different tools to do what I'm going to do in that platform. Using that software to draw. Otherwise, I could spend time going around and around and around and around and around and around, just trying to figure out which brush I like the best.
Right.
And like, that's great. And sometimes maybe you need to spend a half an hour doing that. That's a good, that's not without
But
value
you
either.
should probably also define the amount of time that you're gonna use to make a certain decision, right?
Right.
Otherwise, like you said, you could spend hours and days deciding which brush. So set aside the time, define the time. I'm gonna pick a brush. I have 10 minutes. Let me use these 10 minutes to figure out which brush is gonna work. I'm gonna stick with that brush, because if I spend any more time determining which brush I'm gonna use, the whole project's gonna go down the tubes and take hour or way longer than it should.
And I think that's also the point where it's very similar to the point in where commercial artists really are different than fine artists as well, because it's really valuable to have a client or to have a purpose to what you're doing to help inform those decisions, right? Because that provides a sense of clarity. Like, oh, those boundaries, like you just said, right? Like, oh, like let's write a story, let's draw a story about something happening underwater. And then like suddenly like the next like we're drawing a comic and then 2 pages in, like, why are we on Saturn?
Yeah.
Right? Like if the client is a fishing company, like and this story is all about like water and life in a stream, like that really helps give us some boundaries and like have some things to play with within that space. And it's back to the same thing about the algorithm and the algorithms and the endless choices, right? Like if you didn't have if you didn't only have that $20 to spend and end up buying an album that you weren't so sure about, but then a week later you discover you love it, like that within that space of limitations, like you find solutions or you find connections, right? You find those things that
And you
are important.
find yeah, in that case you find appreciation, because like I didn't love Kid Cudi the first time I listened to his album. I didn't really love it the second time. Maybe I started to like it, but the third time I was like, oh, I get it. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
and that's something that when we're always trying to go on to the next thing, we don't realize that, let me speak for myself. I don't realize sometimes that I'm not giving things the amount of time I used to, and
Yeah.
that, everything out there is an acquired taste, and some things take longer to acquire a taste for than others. It doesn't mean that it's not a taste of yours. It just means that you haven't refined your palate yet.
Yeah. Shakespeare's hard. Shakespeare's hard, right? But if you can, for real, but if you can break down the prose, right? And then you can get into like where the prose is going and start to understand the beats of the story, like no shit, there's a reason this dude's been around for so many years. There's a reason why like all the stories that we see have, some influence by this guy, right? But you can't just get that in 5 minutes. Like it doesn't,
Right.
iambic pentameter doesn't break down for modern contemporary English in 5 minutes, right? You gotta sit and futz with it a little while, like you gotta have
Yeah.
the perseverance to kind of enjoy, like those things. And maybe we're lucky sometimes, like maybe, we get a little bit older, so our patience goes up, or that stinky cheese when you were 5 years old, as you get older, like you're like, oh,
Oh,
it's
damn,
not.
that mold tastes good.
Yeah, and like, oh, and I understand, like with the wine and with this crunchy bread, like now there's a trifecta going on here that like didn't make sense when I was a little kid.
Yeah, I
So
know. That
yeah.
that's perfectly illustrates it. I
So
wonder, talking about the artist side and the design side and both of those coming together, um, what do you enjoy most out of those various elements? And if it makes sense to add it to the question, um, do you enjoy, what is it that you enjoy, the process or the finished product, or conceptualizing even before you really start getting into the process?
oh gosh, I think if you ask like that, it is the process that's the enjoyable part. The process is enjoyable. Like the different, so I guess there are a couple of phases, right, that are really the particularly enjoyable parts of the process, I think. So one is the initial, like getting an idea, right? but then like having an idea that's like enough of an idea to kind of want to invest a little more thought into and think about what that means as defining that like that. So here's part one. Having an idea that you feel is something worth investing further development into of your own energy. And then visualizing what that is as a product, right? So here's the other part of like what we're talking about earlier. In defining something, part of defining it means what is this thing as a product, as a finished piece, right? Like that's so important, right? Like because
and then working your way back.
Yeah,
Figure out how to get there.
and so that we're not just testing out 50 different brushes, like that's part of why we visualize it as a product, so that we're not just like waddling with brushes on a digital screen forever and ever and ever and not deciding anything, right? So there's that first part, right? So and sometimes that could be maybe a personal project or for a client, like getting that initial rush of like the potentiality, right? Then I think the next phase of real enjoyment of like childlike wonderment is like taking those possibilities and then doing the artist side of like drawing, making lists, drawing, making lists, drawing, right? Like that part's a lot of fun too, right? Then comes the harder parts, which are extremely rewarding but much more difficult, which is fielding criticism for all of that drawing and conceptuality, right? And then revising upon it, right? Pain, hard, homework, difficult, critical, right? Critical, right? So then comes
critical in two senses of the word.
Critical, yeah, in two senses of the word, definitely. And then comes the next really great phase, right? After revising to something that suddenly makes sense, right? You've made it through two big chunks of development, right? The idea, the concept, revising the concept into a design, right? And now, like this middle part, kind of the groove gets going, right? Things start making sense. The math is adding up, right? So that chunk of it, putting it together, starting to really get that product to take shape, right? That's a fun part. That middle leg is a workman's leg, but man, it's fun. And then I'd say the next set of revisions are also brutal, right? Because now you got to start getting things into shape. Like, well, there's the technical issues. Maybe there's business issues or production issues that though you took into consideration, still the file types are not quite right, and there's things that need to get ironed out. And then in the process of that, it shifts your design work a little bit. So now you've got to refine and retighten your work a little bit. Like that stage, that's that part of like the legendary crunch of what Cyberpunk 2077, right? That like that's where the crunch happens, right? Because like now you got to get this thing done, but at the same time, like it's painful to revise it to the point that it needs to come to life and hit the market, right?
Why
So
is that? Just because you have parts of it that you developed as an artist that you don't want to let go as a designer, and
right.
like figuring out the practicalities and negotiating practicality of something with love of a piece of art and your brainchild, killing your darlings a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, like that. I think that's a very important lesson. Is like, don't get attached to anything, right? Only get attached to the next step of the process. Don't get attached to the last step, right?
That's good advice.
That's the only place to be attached. Is the next step. And then I'd say the third phase or the third part that's the love part is like completing something, making a client happy, making an audience member, like giving somebody an aha moment with something that you've created. Like it's those three things, right? Like it's those are the three places.
Yeah. What if you're creating something, you don't have a client, but I guess you have an audience, like you're making a comic book that's something that's really part self-expression more than it would be if you're working for a client. I wonder how you direct yourself, because self-expression is something you're doing for yourself, but if you want to use your media to communicate with other people, you also have to have an audience in mind. So that's
Sure.
another area I'd love to explore, because I think that's also interesting.
Sure. I guess I'm a believer that that space is the difference between being a hobbyist and being an artist, right? So, like, if there's wonderfully brilliant, genius level talent making art that do it only for self-expression and without the intention of pleasing anybody or only wanting to make something beautiful, like baking a beautiful cake, making a beautiful painting, um, but not done with the express idea of it finding an audience, right? If it finds an audience, it does, hoping, and a lot of artists sometimes get lost in this place, hoping that there's an audience for what they're doing. But really, the goal is self-expression. And I mean, that's what art therapy is for, right? Like, art can be a play space. Like, being creative is a play space. It can be a space of healing. It can be a space of personal growth. It doesn't have to be only for commercial purposes. Like, that's why I refer to myself as a commercial artist, right? Not as a fine artist. Um, you know, do I have those skills? Do I sit and draw? I mean, I got a stack of drawings right over there that are all my warm-up drawings that I feel good about doing in the morning, but I don't share them with anybody. You know, um, I'm not criticizing anybody for being in that space. I think, though, that art in its own right is one of the most fundamental core businesses. Like, if prostitution is the first business, or like the first, right, then art is the second one, right? Like, right
Yeah, no,
next to it,
yeah,
right?
it makes sense.
And that's whether you're making music or you're making paintings or you're whatever that is. It's the second profession, right, after prostitution, um, and uh, and I mean that in no derogatory sense either. Um, that Finding an audience is such a core principle in being an artist. So basically, either the goal is to find an audience or to use art for personal purpose.
Do you think there's a gray area? Do you think you could blur the lines? Another conversation I have with people often is this idea of, I forget what book and I forget exactly how many people, but if you could find 10 fans of your work who support you with $10 each a month, that's $100, and extrapolate that to build out your finances as an artist for a specific audience, um, then you can make a living through your art. And I wonder if there's a gray area that, like, well, if I if I do it this way, I could appeal to a wider audience. So I'll build my base and I'll be a little less genuine in my self-expression. If I am more self-expressive, my audience will shrink, and 90-10 versus 70-30, something like that you could kind of open the valve a little bit on self-expression, even to the detriment of the expanse of your audience,
I
or
get
expansion of your audience. So I
no,
just wonder if there's a gray line between this dichotomy that you're talking about.
no, I don't think that there is, right? And I think for some people that there is. I don't think for me there is. I think for some
Okay.
people there is, right? Because I think for me it's the same thing. Like, I think James Burke is an artist, right? James Burke, the guy I was mentioning before, who's
Right.
like
Right. Yeah.
making connections, right? I think, like, there are people doing jobs and they bring brilliant self-expression to jobs that are not creative jobs, right? There's artistry there. that to me is being an artist, right? Like being self-expressive and being a painter, you could be a great painter, but not necessarily be an artist, right? Like we're all interpreting things every day. Everybody's interpreting things. The way that we move through the world and synthesize it and use that to inform the decisions that we make, there's an artistry and an expressiveness in how we do those things, in how you're doing your podcast right now, in how I made my coffee this morning, in the song I sing in the shower, right? So no matter what we're doing, there's that part of expression that goes into that. And the way that we choose to engage sort of our observation of the world around us and the activity that we're doing and the way that we allow that to inform those things, the things that we're doing, that's where, to me, that synthesis is artistry, you know? So if you're a lawyer and the way that you get inspired by the situation and the way that you research and put an argument together, that could be extremely self-expressive, right? But it doesn't make you a great painter. You might not be able to pick up a brush and be a painter, right? So that's why I say, to me, I don't really believe that there's a gray space there. It's really much more like a mode of operation than a light switch, right? It's like, how dialed in to the universe that we're living in are we? How much are we just kind of like, you know, breathing the air and allowing the smell of the air to inspire the choices that we make?
So it's we're talking about like a level of consciousness and awareness and presence.
Presence, and then it's the combination of observation and presence and the way that we synthesize that. You know, like our human brains are built to see patterns and to create, you know, to synthesize like our understanding of all of this into the actions that we're doing, you know, and the way that we kind of meditate upon that and the way that we operate, you know, like it's a dance, it's not a light switch, right? Like it's not an on or off thing, right? It's more like a volume bar than it is like an on or an off thing. So some people get locked up and basically it's like they're turning the switch all the way down, right? And then some people are like, you see them and you can see they're just so fucking engaged in life, you know, and it's turned all the way up, right? And they're fluid in the moment. I mean, that's where I think that exists, you know, and that like the way in which we negotiate our observation of the world around us is part of the art that we make as people, you know, and maybe that's cooking and maybe that's cleaning your bedroom and maybe that's, you know what I mean? Like it could be anything. It could be anything.
Right. But ultimately, to be an artist, you have to have that audience. And so ultimately the artist part of it is connecting with others. So it's about community.
Well, so that's where I say it's the second profession, right? Because once you get to that point that you're doing something, like what Carlin said, like if he lived during the time, George Carlin, back to George Carlin. George Carlin said, like if he had been a caveman, like in the time of caveman, because he got criticized for being like, you know, kind of a counterculture guy, but meanwhile, every year he's on HBO making money from Warner Brothers doing a new, you know, doing a new special.
Special,
right? And
yeah.
And he got criticized for that. And he said, yeah, but like, look, if it was caveman era, I'd be going around cave to cave, like telling jokes in front of whoever wants to hear them, right? That's where it is, right? Like that's where it is, right? So like if you can only find 10 people that your work fits for, and those 10 people want to make you, you know, want to make sure that they're your patrons and that, you know, you got a roof over your head and you're creating something for them that inspires them and gives them aha moment. And then they take that out into their life. And then they show that to the love of the people in the world that they're in. And then you're still, man, you're on the path.
Yeah. But I guess your self-expression is secondary to the way that that person accepts, interprets, and enjoys your art. So it's
Sure.
kind of removing the individual aspect of who created it and letting the creations live on their own. Maybe.
Well, and then there's a very interesting thing with that happening right now, right? Like in the midst of all this cancel culture stuff, right? Like what do we do with things like with artists like Woody Allen, right? Like Woody Allen gets a lot of criticism, obviously for some of his lifestyle issues, you know, like Sun Yi marrying his his ex-wife's adopted daughter, right? And like he's that doesn't fit real well into the narrative of like what's culturally acceptable right now. So then, like, what do we do? Like,
But he
with
was a liberal, and to some
right,
degree
well,
still is a liberal icon for
he,
his
he is,
film.
or like Roman Polanski, right? Like other great artists that have created amazing works of art, and
Yeah,
yet, like, I think that like this is a negotiation of the moment. Like when we start like separating, artists and work, or putting artists and work in the same bucket. Like which is it?
right. Yeah. That's
I
totally
don't,
feeds into my comment for sure.
like I don't. If I think about it, I guess dialogue's a great way to kind of think through something. I guess my feeling is like Annie Hall is a brilliant movie, right? Woody Allen's maybe a creepy guy. Like two truths can coexist at the same time,
Right.
and you know what I mean? Like that like Wagner. There's another example, anti-Semite, right? But like you can't take away the influence of Flight of the Valkyrie on like the history of music and other Wagner pieces on the history of like relatively contemporary classical music, right? Um,
Right.
it's influential nonetheless.
Yeah.
So,
This brings me
uh,
back to another episode of a gentleman, Jeffrey Johnson, who's writing a comic book that takes place. It's a fiction. It's a fantasy comic, and he tries to explore ideas of the American Revolution through it. And he kind of brought up a similar point, which was about the founding fathers having owned slaves, and do we tear down all the monuments of every founding
right.
father because of them owning slaves, or do we have a dialogue, like you said, about the bad aspects of them and the terrible things that happened in history, but also recognizing the impact that these individuals coming from that time had on us being here today. So it's
Yeah.
a lot of negotiation, and it's yeah.
I'm not, I, I'm a little frustrated with, um, sort of, I mean, I don't want to derail because I think like this is really, we're talking about creativity and this is not necessarily falling into the realm. However, in the Venn diagram, there's overlap right now. I'm a little bit frustrated with what I perceive, especially because I'm outside the United States. But the direction of the last few years in regard to like cancel culture and hypersensitivity, um, and a sort of like a tyranny in the left to abandon rationalism, I think is very, very problematic. And I think it's going to endanger a lot of artists. It's already endangering comedians. Um,
Right. Yeah.
you know, uh,
I have a personal anecdote.
please, I would love to hear it.
I have a YouTube channel that I run, and the main character on that YouTube channel has a Southern accent, and this is a fictional character.
Mhm.
He is kind of like embodies a villain archetype. Think Cobra Commander or something like that.
Okay.
Like Skeletor, like comedically, stupidly
Over the
villainous
top.
and over the top, and he has like a southern accent. And somebody commented, and this channel does not have all that many followers. It's not very large, trying to grow it and whatnot, and trying to do something interesting and think about social commentary and things like that as we create. Somebody reacted to this character and just said, fuck this guy. He probably doesn't like black people. And that illustrated to me, like, just the gut reaction we have based on limited information. Maybe you have one touch point about a person and you'll automatically judge that person or character based on that one touch point. And like, even talking about it now, it gives me palpitations, because I think that is small, minuscule example of what you are talking about, that we automatically assume the worst of people. We automatically assume that there's no room for negotiation, compromise, or even agreeing to disagree.
Yeah.
And I similarly am like troubled. And a lot of times when I'm writing for that channel or other spaces, uh, I'm constantly, like I mentioned before, I think about things from so many different perspectives. And a lot of times I can find validity in perspectives that do not necessarily coexist. And for me, as a creator, and a writer, I struggle to negotiate these, that I could write it this way. And it's, it goes back to, like you said, comedians already struggling and trying to navigate that their wordsmithing has to be so on point to
Threading a
walk a
needle.
fine line, that
Yeah.
their intent, the intent of their words, is not taken out of context, to be used to vilify them, and that they're able to continue to express themselves and talk about society in satirical kind of ways. Like you're saying, that character that I'm developing is a satire, and the fact that this person commented on that video that way showed me that, like, it's going to be difficult waters for me to navigate forward. And I
Right.
think that illustrates exactly what you're referring to. Into
Yeah.
people don't people nowadays don't necessarily want to understand the intent. They automatically base their judgment based on their interpretation. And I'll, just to further illustrate this point,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
my girlfriend is a designer,
Mhm.
in a variety of different mediums, and she's working for a client right now. And she was saying that basically, when they text a lot to talk about their projects and move the projects forward, and she misunderstood something, and that was articulated to her where she should go with the project. And I said, basically, you should get on the phone and talk to her so that you could have clarity. Because even amongst our so let's say I have my core group of friends. We have a way of speaking that we grew up speaking in Port Chester, New York. There's some specific peculiar notes to the way that we interact with each other, and people from that town in New York interact with each other. Then you go a little bit wider, the metropolitan area. People in New York communicate a certain way. There's certain nuances to phrases, words, that can be that would be interpreted in different ways from people from a different geographic area and from a different friend group, even within that very specific locality,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so the problem, I feel like an old man, but the problem nowadays, I think the problem here is a lack of willingness to understand each other, and people going into an interaction with somebody they don't know is kind of assuming the worst and interpret and because they're assuming that their interpretation of a situation automatically kind of has them gravitate towards a negative interaction as opposed to a neutral or positive interaction, and not looking at the intent, but just automatically assuming that their interpretation is valid and right.
I think that, so there's one thing that, like you said, that I think is interesting, because I often search for some kind of like validation, because, like living in a foreign country where the mentality is very different, right? Um, I feel both guilty and lucky at the same time. Um, like I have enough command of the language here to be able to work with people, but not sometimes to catch all the nuance. And there's a lot of nuance in the language here. But I feel fortunate, though, that what's going on in the United States. So I left 8 years ago. It's a long time, but I'm old enough to say that when you say you feel like an old man for having those opinions, I don't think it's age. I've noticed it kind of hyper radicalize in the last 3 years, last 4 years. And I don't want to say that it's solely based on the politics, especially around, the outgoing administration and the president specifically, but he embodies a sort of behavior that fits in with this type of reactionary behavior that I think has infected both the left and the right, and has been, we get back to like the algorithms that kind of crystallize and calcify the thinking system, and kind of the cancel culture that goes along, and the outrage. It's like this. It's like you said, like to kind of to go with what you said. I feel like there's like this Mexican standoff that can occur at any point in time where everybody's reputation is on the line, and like suddenly it's going to turn into fucking Reservoir Dogs, and everyone's got a gun out, and whoever gets canceled is never going to have a job again. Like what the fuck is wrong with society right now? Like, wait a second. Like that's what I mean. Like rationalism has gone out the window, and like with that, like the scientific process has gone out the window, right? So like meanwhile, like what's crazy about it is like we talk about businesses need to iterate faster, right? Well, what is iteration? Iteration is the scientific process, right? So like in business, it's okay, but in social interaction, it's not. Like what's going on here? Something is. And I don't think that it's just age. I really don't. I don't think that it's something that you say, like, you feel like an old man. No, something has radicalized society, especially in the West. And watching it from across the ocean, it is shocking. It is unsettling.
Watching it from in the U.S. is unsettling. Like even on one of the reasons. One hesitation I had doing a podcast was because I was afraid of having these discussions. I'm very frankly happy that we're having the discussion, because this is like self-expression and getting some steam off, because I felt stifled as a creator. The example that I already shared with you, that I want to walk that line. I don't want to avoid difficult conversations, but rather I want to create stories and characters that force people to look them in the face, the issues, and confront their fears and confront the fact that we are all the same, which is, my naive, idealistic core heart is whenever I have a moment where I just feel lost and really I can't put into words I can't put into a story what I want to, because I'm afraid of criticism from all angles and misinterpretation. I always kind of come back to the point where, like you said, the right and the left have been similarly polarized to the point where there's no room for even agreeing to disagree.
Right. Like
And
it's terrible. And like, please let me very, very clearly say, like, I've long been like, okay, I used to work as an editorial cartoonist and struggled with like my feelings towards the right going back 20 years ago, right? And grew up having hippie parents and grew up where, like, all of my neighbors, well, a lot of my neighbors are mixed, Latino, Black, Jewish, like very, very mixed, like constantly, right? So, that's part of my identity, right? Like I believe in that, right? I believe that is fundamentally, like, in places where things overlap and mix is the place where creativity occurs. So, like, what the fuck is going on the left, where like nobody can have any kind of opinion anymore? Like and like at the same time, like when I see the right, I mean, it's frightening because what you see is like nationalism and something that I can understand why people make Nazi comparisons and why you see the trucks driving around with flags from across the ocean. I'm not there. I'm across the ocean, and I saw someone, like, I know this is anecdotal, but I see it, like, pickup trucks with flags supporting the president, and like the Proud Boys and this kind of radicalization, and like held up to pictures of ISIS and Al Qaeda, and it looks remarkably similar. Like, just on the surface, it looks remarkably similar. So it's disturbing to see the part that I've always identified with becoming so radicalized, and to see the other side going like absolutely bananas. And like you said, there's no, how do we get to a point where, as a society, I think I know the answer for us as individuals, but I don't know how in society we're going to kind of like dial this back,
yeah, and just a point where we could talk to each other and realize that despite differences, yeah, I mean, I think the majority of people can sit down and have a cup of coffee together or coexist in the same supermarket. Like, I think part of it is exasperated by the, seeing it on the news. One of the reasons I'll go back to starting the podcast. One of the reasons I started the podcast was because I was like, felt uncomfortable interacting with people, even people I knew very well, on social media because of the short form nature of tweets, the short form nature of comments and posts on Facebook, and then just like the vitriol and how the proportion of posts that were on Facebook that were political. Just like, I don't want any part of that. How can I just connect with people in a meaningful way, have interesting conversations, have ideas, bounce them off of one another? Maybe I said things that at the end of this conversation, I'm going to say, what, I don't really agree with what I said an hour ago, but it's not without these conversations that I do not, without these conversations, I don't have those realizations. I don't have the opportunity for those realizations.
Yeah.
And I think that's why podcasts are powerful tools. And so I going back to what I was originally saying, because the emphasis of Facebook and places where I would usually connect with my friends was emphasizing the polarization of society. I think it is worse than it seems worse than it actually is.
I think that's probably, like, I think that's correct. Not probably. I think that is correct, right? Like, when I lived in the South, I went to school in Memphis and I worked in Central Florida, and I would drive all the way through, I've driven many times to Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana. And I was always surprised by how much the South was much more than being, like a Miami Beach guy. Like, that's an island, like literally it's an island, So my idea of the South was always this kind of like Dukes of Hazzard, cotton picking, foghorn leghorn, right? And then like in Memphis, I saw like kind of like that more like that Faulkner and the deeper, richer literary tradition that doesn't feed into the negative stereotypes, irregardless of the conflicted history, right?
Right.
And I found that to be beautiful and reassuring, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I could say the same for having moved to North Carolina a year ago.
And so like when we take out sort of the facade, right? Because like the facade serves a purpose, but like I think we're living in an era where the facade is more valuable than like what's underneath the facade, right? And like it's being leveraged and capitalized, and like that's exactly like let's go right back to an earlier part of the conversation. Like that's where our curators become influencers, right? Like they're not it's not the cool guy or the annoying guy at the comic store, or the record shop, or the game store. Like no. Like those people didn't have like, and it comes back to the same thing. They didn't have skin in the game insofar as like promoting a brand,
Right.
right? Like they were like, nah, I think this is cool, right? Like, and because they connected with it on some kind of an emotional level that made it to them seem cool, right? Like this is the part where like that facade has become a shell, and it's like I keep feeling like calcified is all I can think of as like the word for, or like radicalized, calcified, polarized. Like these are the words that I find fit the way that things are being presented back to society, right?
Yeah.
And um and the other thing is like unfortunately due to the fucking pandemic, uh the weaknesses in each society are being sort of like turbocharged, right? So like the weaknesses that were pre-existing in the economy of the United States, the polarity of wealth inequality, right? um
It's like
job
a pool with
jobs.
a puncture in the liner, and it's like it's dripping out, but then eventually the pressure builds enough that the seams start coming.
Yeah.
Sorry,
And
I interrupted
no,
you.
that's
Yeah.
all right. Like, and it's happening in every country a little bit, or not a little bit. It's completely happening. So, like, here, the same thing. Like, fortunately, it's not nearly as dramatic and bad as it is in the United States with the virus here, but it's put a lot of pressure on the family structures here because work here is like so much more prevalent. Like the father goes off to work and works, like in the old school, like 1950s, 1960s idea of the family, the nuclear family is still a pretty solid structure. Like there's a middle class here that's not, it doesn't make as much money as the United States, but it's much broader and much more robust because CEOs don't necessarily have such wealth. Like the wealth gap isn't as great in this country. It's much more diversified. So, but at the same time, like there is still a lot of the same problems, the same global problems that are going on, evident here in this society as well. So, like those pressures of like what to do with the kids, what to do, like how the family balances out its time, like they're occurring here too. I just there's a lot of pressure on the system here. I don't. I'm thankful to be uh, I'm thankful to be here. I love this country. I feel great sadness and frustration though watching my own country and torn between sometimes. No, I don't feel torn. I feel torn for the people that are there, and I said it, guilty. I keep coming back to I feel guilty to have to deal with a different set of issues, and that I still have skin in the game back in the U.S.
I don't
emotional.
know if Luis told you, but and by the way, people listening,
Yeah, we should mention Luis.
Luis
Definitely.
Santa Marina, Luis Santa Marina, who was I think guest 4 or 5, and we had a similarly deep conversation exploring what he would describe as metaphysical aspects of creativity and depression, and overcoming some of the humps when you're trying to put a creative work into the world. He connected us, and one of the reasons he did so is because I mentioned to him that I had lived in Japan for 2.5 years, basically 2 1-year stints.
Mhm.
Yeah, I similarly felt when I was there, like a relief and disconnect. And I lived there probably around when you first arrived, 2000, first in 2006, 7, and then 2010, 11, around there.
That's a little
And
before me, but yeah.
yeah, I'm even though the situation wasn't the same then, I felt relief that I didn't have to follow politics, but also some guilt that I was like getting off easy. I don't know if that's what you're describing, but I feel that I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I
Being
mean,
an
well,
being
okay,
an expat.
okay, again, two things. So first, Luis is I don't know if everyone, like, just to mention Luis, like I have, that's he's my partner on a project, and we're both kind of busy, so we kind of let that lapse a bit. But Luis is a great guy and like has a totally interesting take on things and very fantastic. His interest in metaphysical and how it pertains to creativity and to his art, I think, are absolutely wonderful and creative and playful. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to Luis.
And
Um,
not only a shout out to Luis, but so before I interviewed Luis, I skimmed through his body of work, pretty quickly to get an idea and a feel for his artwork. And then coming into today's conversation, I read as much as I could today of 66 Days.
yeah,
Yeah, which is your collaborative web comic with Luis. That is basically you guys started when the pandemic hit, and you
yep,
were. It was kind of like a journal in a way,
yeah,
and some of what we ended up talking about today. I mean, you explored through that comic and saying. One of the posts that I pulled up, luckily, and read, and I pulled up and I was like almost tempted to read it. Before even knowing that the conversation would take this turn, was that you said basically you were looking on Facebook from overseas and seeing two friends fighting about masks. It's like, can we just wear freaking masks and talk about something that's actually debatable and important? Because we're focusing on really the easy stuff and disagreeing about the easiest of things to agree on.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I mean, to talk about coming full circle, that was like the comic that out of the 10 or so that I read today, that I kept up. And for anybody listening, shout out to Luis, obviously, but also shout out to the project that you and Luis did together, because when I was reading it today, um, it it hit notes and hit chords with me, even though you wrote it many months back, or a few months back in the beginning or middle of the pandemic. Those messages and those feelings and those anxieties and the coping and making comedy of a bad situation, but also underneath the comedy still having that uncertainty, that still resonates with us today here in December leading into Christmas 2020. So
And the reason, like, we
shout
call it
out to you too.
66 days.
That was a great project. I'm excited when we wrap up and over the weekend to read through the rest of them. And I hope that you guys continue on. I know that it was a tough pace to maintain.
Yeah, I'm thankful for the fact that I know, like, Lewis is really busy right now. So, and at the time, like, it seemed to be, the world was ending. Like, it seemed like the beginning of, like, The Walking Dead was going to occur. Some kind of like zombie situation was like happening. Frightening, right? Frightening. Um, and basically all of my work kind of went on hold immediately. And I think like we were both in a situation of like, what the fuck? Like we actually we both worked together on for an indie publisher, Earth Dog Studios, and they do some great comics. Uh, and you know, check out Earth Dog Studios for anyone who's listening. Great sci-fi. You know, in the purest sense of like conceptual sci-fi stuff. So Lewis and I had both been working separately, but with the guy who's the publisher and writer, the lead writer there, and Tim, who's another sweetheart of a person, and so I needed to get some files from him, and he just said he was preparing some things for print, and he said just contact this guy Lewis directly, and you know, like it happened to be what, March, the beginning of March. So the way that it was in the comic was absolutely what happened. You know, like I don't know this guy. I never talked to him before, Luis. And you know, I was just like, oh yeah, I need these files, blah blah blah. We're exchanging in, you know, in a G chat or something. And I just mentioned like, is it what's going on with this in Argentina? You're in Argentina, right? And like, you know, we were both kind of in a bit of a state of shock, like what, like trying to understand and put it into perspective somehow. And we were kind of being a little bit absurd, like, you know, the Queen of England and Donald Trump and Godzilla and all these different like random things that like could be mixed into it if it was a conspiracy theory, and kind of laughing at that. And yeah, like literally the next day I was still thinking about kind of like that as a joke, and that like, not just that as a joke, but like talking to somebody else about it, and like realizing like somebody that is on the other side of the world that I've never met before, like we you know, we might share a professional connection in common, but I don't know this guy, he doesn't know me, and yet like we're able to kind of like share sort of like that what the fuck moment, you know? And like we kind of we were laughing like, oh, this could be made for a funny comic in that initial conversation. And yeah, that idea just, it resonated enough that like I had to reach back out to him again. You know, like a couple of days later, I was like, hey, I'm still thinking about this, and you know, do you have like maybe like an hour a day or something like that, and maybe we'll put a couple panels together and we could just like put this thing together, and what will we call it, and how long is this going to go on for? And so that's how it happened, you know?
Yeah. And all of that comes through like, because you kind of recapture the way that the comic started in the comic, has like a meta feel like that. And intertwined into it is, you know, your collaborative process working from Japan and Argentina, and, you know, Luis becoming busy and suddenly he's not able to keep up a little bit, all the while exploring your daily life in Japan, Luis's daily life with his family in Argentina, and the terror of the moment, but also finding comedy like these big kaiju battles that you mentioned. So yeah, it's really cool. There are many cool layers to it, and they come together in a neat way. And I'm enjoying it. Yeah.
It was, you know, like it's a little unsettled, and you know, in part like during the process of this, like I had to move, I had other work, he had other work, you know, that came back, and like I think we were both relieved once we were getting busy, but at the same time like feel a sense of that is not resolved. It's unresolved, you know, in regard to that project. But I mean, like I guess a lot of journals are, you know, when you write a journal doesn't, like we're talking about the creative process, right? So like here's the creative process at work. There's some of the pages, some of the panels I like as myself as a cartoonist and illustrator of my own work. Some of them I hate, quite frankly. I'm not totally satisfied with them. However, the goal as a product was to put a web cartoon, a web comic together and do it like on the fly and make it a journal, and don't make excuses for bad drawings, right? Like don't overwork something, just like get it in there, get it done. Don't be precious, right? Like there's another day to do it.
That's a good mantra. I have a couple.
Yeah,
I need to start a list of mantras I start from guests on the podcast. Don't be precious is going to be among the top.
don't be precious. Don't. It's not a baby. It's not precious. Like you'll have a new idea, you'll do a new drawing, right? And so I'm sure like there's the whole idea. Your record is what you say it is. Who said Bill Belichick or one of the coaches? One like somebody, Bill Parcells or one of those like football coaches said something like that, right? So like yeah, there's a truth to it. Like sure, some of the drawings are good, some of the drawings are bad, and somewhere within the space of good drawings and bad drawings, we all exist as creators, right? Like no matter if you have good songs and bad songs, so like fine, let that be. The point though, like which is similar to what we were talking about process, is that like this is really a journal, and how do we turn a journal into a product? And then then there's still the negotiation of like resolving something that's kind of an unresolved situation in life anyhow. um
Right.
so there are layers, right? There's layers to that, like so in regard to it being a product and a concept, like I feel very proud of it as a journal and as a rough sketch of life, and obviously as a collaborative piece, like that's the most critical part, like working with another artist to tell a story.
I'm just laughing because like so I'm assuming you drew the panels that are about you and Luis. It's very
Yeah.
blatantly clear because Luis has like what we described on the podcast when I was speaking with him, interviewing him when he was my guest, as grotesque cuteness. And there was another word that he added in the beginning of it that I'm drawing a blank on now, but there was another adjective, grotesque cuteness. And the way that Luis depicts himself is absolutely hilarious. As you're talking about it, the images are coming back to me of your drawing of yourself at the desk, like writing something or walking down a strip in Tokyo. I see Skytree behind you, or I guess it's Skytree behind you, which hits a nostalgia point for me. So that's already like chalking up some points on the board. And then Luis comes in and he's like fat, laying in bed, looks terrified with the glow of the this screen on his face. Like I just love how it's coming together. And I totally interrupted you, and I apologize. I was just like cracking up.
um yeah, like that was the part of it that I think there are parts that really work well, that we both kind of like have moments where we do a couple of panels and spotlight kind of our own thought or moment in our own process in that moment. But the parts that also my intention was that from the beginning was that like it be really a ping pong situation where like it doesn't matter that stylistically we don't draw the same, like
No, to the contrary, it enhances it.
yeah.
It's if you go into it knowing, even if you go into it not knowing what the project is, I think you would soon realize what it is, even without explicitly being told.
Yeah, yeah, and that like
Yes.
like voices in a chorus, or like two notes, three notes in a chord, right? Like finding like allowing F sharp and G to kind of make a sound together. Or I don't know. There's a bad choice of notes, but like letting two notes like kind of work together is really the point, right? So yeah, that was a big part of that process and that project. And I I know Lewis got a little frustrated because he had other work going on at times, and I just always try to just be like, don't worry about it, like do what you could do, just whatever that is, just, like, let's just keep doing whatever we can do with this. And like, don't, again, don't be precious about like making mistakes. Let's just keep putting it up. But here's the one other thing. Damn, I wish I had an editor when I was working on that one. Oh man. Like, because it was really seat of our pants. We were putting it together day by day. I was going, like, I was intending to spend like an hour a day on it. But then the only thing was that I would do a little bit of editing because Lewis's first language is not English. But he does fine. Like, there's not in any way criticism of his language skills.
He was on a 2 or 3 hour podcast with me speaking English the whole time.
Yeah, he's fine. But like, I still would have to take like Lewis's script, Lewis's art, and I'm happy to do it. Like, have no, and then my own art and letter it all. Like, I did the lettering on it, so that became kind of like a bit of a bottleneck. That like, there's no way to have an editor unless the editor was like literally sitting next to me to, to be like, can you quickly proofread this? And that, like, I was really hoping to get at least 3 out a week, and that's tricky when you don't
going
have,
back to
the,
I mean,
it's guys.
Yeah, it's going back to the boundaries. You're setting a boundary of an hour. This becomes a time challenge. X, Y axis time is one of your variables, and you have to keep moving forward when you're in a situation, a pinch, and you have crunch time like that.
But also, like, and also the athletics of it, right? Like the creative athletics of it. Like, we all, everyone, I think creatives all get frustrated. Like, when you're not reminding yourself, or other people aren't reminding you of your accomplishments. Like, if you're not creating every day, if at the end of the day, even if you are creating, but you're not getting the feedback of, like, sitting with a client and the client's like, oh, this is great, or can we change this? Or sitting with an editor, or getting email from your readers, or, like, especially in this moment of COVID and everyone's stuck at home so much of the time, it can be like, I sometimes feel like, what did I get done this year? Right?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you because this is something that plagues me often, and I've been developing some strategies to solve it. But do you think that it's a question of getting validation over the quality of what you're producing, or just somebody telling you that you did enough today? You produced enough. You met some sort of quota. You weren't lazy, and you actually did something and achieved something. If you were able to divide it into those two categories, which is the one that you're looking for on a daily basis? Maybe you're looking for both. I'm not going to force you to decide one or the other, but.
It's a really good question. So I think it's a really important question, to be honest, for everybody, not only creatives, right? Like, when do you get to the end of the day and you decide, like, you've hit satisfaction? And if your goal is to work 8 hours to get a paycheck, then when you get to 8 hours and that paycheck is substantiated, then, like, I think, then that's what it is. But if you have a different guideline for yourself, if you work independently and if you have to make or provide a service, I think that there's two parts, because I think you're right. Your question is right on, right? Like, what is that, right? Is it does it come from inside, or is it do we need external praise? And I think we need both. And maybe it's just me. Maybe I need both, but I need both, right? And I need both, and they fulfill different needs. And because it's that creativity doesn't happen in a bubble, right? And we need human interaction. Humans need humans. You know, we're not a singular, like maybe there's some hermits, you know, there's some of us are antisocial, sure, but largely humans need humans, right? So we need to get something, you know, we all need that. Validation, that validation. So this comes back to also the same part. This is a real return to another cycle of this conversation, which is making art. Is it something that we do for ourselves, or is it something that we do for other people? Well, I mean, there's validity to, like I said, at that point, there's validity to both parts, right? And it's the same. I think it's a very similar thing. And there's something extremely validating. And I think that it's extremely important in doing a hard day's work. You know, like nobody can verify that for you more than we all know ourselves. And you gave it your all. You know,
you're tired. You earned, yeah.
Whatever that is, whether it's 8 hours or 10 hours or 6 hours or half a day, and then you got to go do something else, whatever that is. But in the time that you committed to doing the grind, you committed to the grind, right? No one can take that feeling away of knowing that you did it right. And even if, so for example, there's an external part, it's a client or it's a teammate or somebody else doesn't like what you did, you can shrug it off and be like, look, I did what I thought was right, you know?
Right. You're still moving forward, because if you didn't provide that to the external person, your colleague or your client, and get the feedback, then you would not have moved the process forward. Even by seemingly having failed at that first pass, you are putting yourself in a position where you can receive feedback and move, edit it, redraft it, do whatever you need to do to get it where it needs to be. But having not tried in the first place or got it to that point in the first place, you wouldn't be quite that far along in the process.
And I think this also goes to another part of the conversation, which is like sort of the moment that we're living in, like this current epoch of like calcification and outrage and all of this stuff, is like the thing that we're failing as a society on, but that we don't lose in the context of this conversation is the ability to make mistakes, the value of making mistakes, right? Like if the mistake is made in, without ill intent, right? Or without negligence, not in a state of negligence, then and it informs the next thing that we do or say or decision that we make, then is it a mistake? Right? Like, I don't really think so, it's part of the process. And if we're wise enough and we're not greedy about the restraints that we put on ourselves and the pressures that we put on ourselves, we fudge the time and the scheduling and how we do things to accommodate for those things and for those things in others, right? So like, if you and I make a mistake in how we schedule, like for example, like we actually did, right? We made a little bit of a mistake,
yeah.
Both of
I'll
us.
take ownership.
It doesn't matter, right? Like it's irrelevant, right? Like it doesn't matter who. That's the part. Like you don't have to take ownership of it, right? The process of life is like we both want to get to somewhere, right? We're trying to get somewhere, and like maybe you took a wrong turn, and maybe I took a wrong turn. but like we both kind of like, oh, okay, here's the next turn that we take, and here's our way back onto the on-ramp, right? Like, that's what I said. Like, I think that's where the solution is on the societal level, but we have the power to make that on the personal, you know? And then on the societal, it's really tough right now to interject that kind of thinking in a bigger sense. But that's where it's like,
yeah, recognizing a mistake not as a be all end all and the punctuation on a process, but rather a point to learn from, a point to pivot, a point to recalibrate, a point to redraft, change course, whatever word and phrase you want to throw at what you are doing to correct a mistake, and then moving forward. So don't let the mistake be the end. Let it be the point for some sort of change. And
yeah. And I think like this also comes back to the same, like what's going on in the last like 3 or 4 years in American society and spreading out to the world, which is like, when the leader of the free world is unable to say, I made a mistake and we're reanalyzing the direction in which to take this, then how the fuck can anyone else, right? It enables every baby in the world to expect somebody else to take ownership, right? And like, it's not only ownership, it's like, it's the part of it that's the scientific process, right? It's the part of it that's like, we thought this, we were going down this direction with it. And as we've gone down it, we've realized that this is not the direction that we need to go. And
mistake, as we've been calling it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Exactly.
And like, maybe we don't even have to call it a mistake, right? Maybe we have to go down this way to understand that it's not, you know, and that we've started to like, we all have a little of this. Like, nobody likes to make a mistake, right? We don't like to, I'm sensitive to that shit. When my wife tells me like, you didn't wash the dish here, there's still a piece of something on the dish. Like, why is this way? You know, like, nobody likes to be corrected in that fashion, right? But on some level, nobody holds us to mistake making in a higher sense of, you know, pressure than we do to ourselves, right? Like, why did I do that? Hey, why did I do that? You know, like embarrassment, shame, like, so when we start projecting that onto other people, right? Like, it's you know, there's two sides to the coin, and it says a lot about us as individuals, right? Like, I often, this is kind of a philosophical thing, but I often feel like I don't like the word blame, you know, like
to blame somebody,
to self-blame, blame, you know, like what, you know, it's fair to say like what happened, what went wrong, why did this happen, how did this happen, you know, those kinds of questions are fair. But when you start getting into like little things and
because
then someone tells you, oh,
I guess blame has a sense to the word and a nuance that indicates some sort of, and maybe this is just in my own head, but shame. Right. And I think it is different because I'm trying to think of a analogy, but that a word that may not carry that same sense of the word or nuance within the word. And maybe, you know, like the difference between accountability and blame. Somebody's accountable for the mistake or the problem. And I mean, blame is like the action of, it's an accusation, right?
Right. And like, you know, like look at what happened with Fauci, like in the beginning of this whole situation, right? Like, so many people in the science community were saying like a virus is such a small microorganism that, you know, wearing a mask is pointless because it can travel right through the mask, right? And I was certainly in the very, very beginning of this, like, especially being in Asia where people wear masks whenever they get hay fever, right?
Right.
Like, I think I think it's overdoing it, but in the very beginning of this, I was like, nah, it doesn't make sense to wear a mask, right? And then as more and more evidence began to come out, and like the science became a little more clear in regard to transmission and what's going on, like, of course, like it became evident that like, oh, these masks are making some difference, right? And so again, it's like the same thing like about two truths being existent at the same time. It is true that a virus is such a small microorganism that it can slip right through that fiber, right? However, it's also true that by wearing a mask, you're reducing the risk to yourself and to other people, right? Like two truths can be like, and they're not, we're not talking about fake news and like alternative facts. Like two things can be simultaneously true that don't seem like they correlate, or, you know, and that
Yeah.
like instead of blaming, like instead, if everybody, which this is the problem, people blaming, you know, like, well, the news said this and masks don't make sense and civil liberties, and then suddenly it gets like the blame game, like doesn't support rational thinking.
Yeah. Going back to accountability, blaming
So
is putting accountability on somebody else. I mean,
right,
typically, you
right,
know,
right,
yeah,
and
I think about pointing fingers all the time, and we're very reluctant to point fingers at ourselves or
right,
actually put our fingers away and just think about a solution to the problem and stop acting like everybody is at fault. And yeah, I mean, it's at some point when you're just blaming, you're complaining,
yeah,
and
yeah,
you're not
yeah,
actually problem solving. And that's what drives me personally nuts, is that who I don't give a shit whose fault it is. How about we just fix the problem?
right. Right. And in an era of facade, right? In this era of facade, like um the you know, like the identity, the brand identity of the individual becomes the currency, right?
Right. And to have tarnish on that by taking any self accountability and admitting fault is it becomes harder to do, I guess, when you're maintaining your own individual brand.
Right. And it becomes, because of the currency of it, it becomes valuable to be able to peg something onto somebody instead of like looking at something conceptually, right? So like here's a funny example of this, and it comes back to the creative. You know, I grew up a huge Star Trek fan, right? Like I love old school Star Trek, Next Generation, the original stuff, right? And like I've been trying to watch like the most recent iteration of Star Trek, right? And what I realize is that it's doing exactly the same thing that you're talking about right now, right? Whereas the old Star Trek was an assemblage of characters, an ensemble, and they always had a central concept, right? A something that characters that were maybe feature characters plus the ensemble had to kind of grapple with, that was unseeable, some unseeable concept that maybe is visualized through spaceships and planets and alien races, using that as the device to make a conceptual entity into a visual representation, right? And
So
that then
essentially exploring themes and using the using the boundaries of spaceships, and the
this
ensemble
genre,
cast to explore themes. Is
yeah,
that accurate
absolutely.
rephrasing? Okay.
Absolutely, and 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 that through the lenses of the characters, and in a 5 act structure, we come to a conclusion, right? Um, and granted, it's a formula. Here's a product, right? Here's a product. 5 act structure. We've got some kind of conundrum concept, and after 5 acts, you know, we're going to analyze this and come to a conclusion. And that each character is, instead of being, even though there might be main characters, they provide a lens through which we look at the problem. Dr. McCoy is the skeptic. Spock is the complete rationalist. Kirk is the pathos, right? And maybe the formulation changes with Next Generation, but only slightly, right? Only slightly. A little more nuance,
And
but,
probably the problem, I assume, I'm not a Star Trek fan. I haven't watched it, at least. I'm sure if I did, I probably would become one. I assume the problem that they're looking at changes, the themes that they're exploring change.
yeah, there's more nuance there,
Yeah.
but at its core, that's what the product is, right? Like an ensemble to use as lenses, and sometimes the subject or the target of the conundrum, the philosophical conundrum of the week, right? And that it plays out in 5 acts. And that's where in the current iteration, it's become the opposite, or it's become like the model that we're talking about now, where the facade of the characters and their emotionality and reaction has become the currency for which the story is told. And the conundrum has been put into a secondary role, right? That the characters themselves,
I don't know. I almost want to cry or something because like I felt exactly the same thing watching Gundam Unicorn.
Okay.
Relative to the old original Gundams.
Uh-huh.
And like you, I think, explained to me, like you helped me figure out why I could not appreciate Gundam Unicorn and frankly why I hate it. And I think I'll have to go back and watch it and watch both and kind of think about it from a more thematic and the way that the story is told and what's emphasized and what's made important in the story. But I think that you might have nailed on the head for me something that I've been like grappling with, which is why do I not like this? And why does it feel so different?
Right.
And I think it might be exactly the same thing that you're describing about Star Trek.
Yeah. And like these are, we are fortunate to be, stories are so integral. Like, this is the one thing that's also part of all of this conversation, which is like at the bottom, underground, underneath all of this is still the universality of storytelling. So inside of games, inside of branding and marketing, inside of comics, of course, inside of illustration, there's design, there's always a story, right? Like story is currency as well. And we're fortunate to be in a moment where story has become something that people have become more aware of in regard to the value of it for the application of distributing information, right? However, it's extremely manipulative. Like there's a lot of ways to manipulate, right? If it's not done right, we end up feeling manipulated. When it's done right, we receive a piece of information that we have aha, right?
Yeah.
And like that's where that's I think also very much of the moment right now. Like that's in the zeitgeist of creativity right now. And like whatever's not working for you in Gundam Unicorn is really some part of that, right? Like you're ending up feeling manipulated emotionally instead of receiving information.
Well, instead of inspired. And yeah, I mean, what I gather from what you're saying too is that the emphasis is less on the themes that are being explored and more of the validity of each character's emotion and like ego in a sense. You
Absolutely.
know, each character, its individuality transcends the themes that are supposed to bring us together,
Definitely.
or at least the themes that we're supposed to see from each character's perspective. We're no longer seeing the themes from their perspective, rather we're seeing their kind of personality and selfishness as the emphasis of the story, if that makes sense. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, their facade is more valuable than the currency of the concept.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And we're seeing this a lot play out right now. Like this is again like back to the same issue of like woke being like woke in society, right? Like there's a real serious issue of like token wokeness, right? Like you know, and I think Star Trek's a great model of this. Like Star Trek always had like, look, in the middle of the Cold War, one of the main characters, especially the second, third season, is Chekhov, who's like a Russian guy, right? Like how much more of a character that goes against type, you know, can you really go for? Like let's forget the lens of the current moment, you know, like so. But meanwhile, now I think like most audiences, regardless of like whatever bullshit, hyper polarization with like, you know, America's divide, most audiences, I think, largely are willing to accept diversity amongst their characters, right? Most people, no matter what the level of nuance is, because that makes an interesting story, right? So why is it so important now that like sexual identity be like that's the kind of like the thing du jour, right? Um, look, let me like clearly state, I don't have anything against transgenderism, right? But like, why do those kinds of like why in here's Star Trek again? Why are they force feeding a transgender character into that storyline? You know, into that program at the moment. Like that's something that's going on. You're seeing a lot of that right now. Why? Like what? It's the facade of it. It's because that in this current moment is like what the thing is. You know, that we're grappling with as a society, and instead of in the old model or in successful models, because it's not only the old model. Like I was talking about Star Trek, but it's not only Star Trek, right? In good science fiction, in good fiction, in good storytelling, like maybe we have an allegory. We use an allegory, and we allow the audience to make the connection through the lenses that the character provides onto the allegory, right? So that like maybe instead of saying that the character is transgendered, maybe we need a character that's like a caterpillar that becomes a butterfly, right? And we don't have to even say the word gender, and we deal with looking at what makes a change, something that is difficult for other people to deal with, or something as a society that we're dealing with, and that we look at it as allegory to analyze instead of having to look at the facade of is there a penis or is there a vagina?
Yeah.
Right? And that's where, right? Like that's where we as creatives can offer opportunity.
Well, I wonder in Star Trek's past if there was a non-gendered.
There was.
Right. Yeah, I thought so. And I think that's interesting because I can see how people who are underrepresented and or feel underrepresented, how they benefit from seeing somebody who looks like them or who represents them being portrayed in media. But I do agree with you that oftentimes it feels less of a authentic part of the creative process and storytelling than it is, like you said, doing something to create a facade and putting a placeholder there just so that they could stake the claim that they had a transgendered character. And that's
Right.
what, and I have no problem with diverse casts of characters, with transgendered, with non-binary, with
Yeah, who
anybody and
cares?
everybody present. But there is a feeling of inauthenticity when it's done in a way that doesn't feel authentic. And I don't like using the word authentic because it's pretty subjective, but there is something that feels like it wasn't a choice made because it made the best sense for the story, but rather it made the most sense for staking a claim in the current political climate. And it's one of those things. It's a difficult topic for me to talk about because I don't want my intent to be misinterpreted
Misconstrued, right?
and misconstrued. But I think a lot of people out there would agree that some of the representations out there are just don't feel like they had the story in mind, or that they were done for more marketing purposes in the end. And yeah, it's a tough topic for me to talk about, and it's a tough it's a tough topic to think about. And at what point does it feel authentic? I don't, that's something I have to explore and think about and talk about. But if I can't talk about it, then I can't have a dialogue, and I can't come to a solution to the problem, and maybe a mistake in the way that I'm looking at it. And
Right.
maybe those stories and shows, or whatever they are, maybe they are not having any criticism the way that they're portraying the characters, just because they simply are portraying the characters. And because of that, it ends up feeling inauthentic, because it's a hard spot to criticize that point of the story and saying that feels inauthentic in the current climate.
Yeah. Well, so like I love and I really value like what you're saying, right? Like in the difficulty that I can feel your difficulty in approaching this topic. And I don't want to put you in a situation of being compromised, right? And
But at the same time, that's the whole point for me doing this podcast, so that I'm not having a conversation on Facebook, but rather we have a dialogue and we think about issues that are difficult to talk about and explore.
yeah.
Right.
And um well, I was going to caveat a little bit what I just said, which is this week, like I've been interviewing to find myself a new business consultant for my own business, because everyone's, I need like an editor, right? Like somebody who's external to myself to help me do business growth. And this person was asking me questions, and I got to a point in the conversation where, like you, I was feeling tension just now. Like I could feel your tension, right? And I was in that point in this conversation with this person 2 days ago, right? And I had this thing, or I have this feeling of like, when we get to that point, there's actually something underneath there that's really what we have to kind of dig into a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
Because that feeling is very revelatory about something that we're feeling. And it's not this topic specifically, right? It's what this topic is doing to us as people. And it's not this topic, but it's kind of like, it's this tokenism, right? It's a sort of tokenism in society. So like I offer that, like in this case, in any show or any program or any storyline, that it's not what I want to see is, okay, the character's transgender. I don't care. Make that person interesting, not because they're transgender.
Right.
Right? Like,
yeah.
Then when the moment happens where that character has to reveal something about themselves, if it relates to their experience, let that be true. And then that gives people a place to connect.
Yeah,
You know?
that's yeah, I think that's beautifully said, actually, because then it's genuine. Then you can say, now I relate to this person who before I may have not related to. Now I understand their perspective more deeply because they're not a caricature of a group of people that you're placing into a show just to have representation, but actually they are a person first and foremost
Right.
before they are part of this category of people. And I think
So,
that's what I was saying before when I don't even know what I was talking about at that point, maybe just my concern about society, but what brings me back to feeling whole and optimistic again is always the realization that at the end of the day, we are all people. We have
yeah.
the same needs, wants, desires, the same things to survive. And yeah, we could all find commonality in those things, right? And we could all appreciate that everybody wants somebody to love them. Everybody wants to love something. And yeah,
My favorite,
when
oh,
stripped back, no, you're good. When stripped back all the way down to our bare bones, I think that truth will be revealed. I certainly hope so.
yeah, like I had when I was doing the comic with Lewis a few months ago, earlier in the year. Um, there's one strip that I did that later on I had a lot of response to, which was about like my wife and I went for a walk and found a bar that was open, and there were people inside like drinking, and it was at a time when Tokyo was kind of like shut down, right? And the moral dilemma of the moment, right? And that like not the politicization that's occurred because of like how things have developed and should things be open, should things not be open, but the moral dilemma of like the need for human interaction and contact, and the fact that like um, you know we crave a kind of warmth, and we crave to connect with people, and at what point is the risk and the reward and the kind of like prophylactic mitigation on society all kind of occurring at the same time, and that and it really happened like this. That was no question, it was a real story. And we wandered into a bar and ended up staying and getting kind of shit faced that night, and talking with people we don't know, and nobody's wearing a mask, and it was kind of still in the very beginning of this thing, and it made me really kind of understand the other side of like the people who kind of are even still reluctant to like acknowledge the seriousness of the situation, right? Not because of a lack of ability to comprehend the situation, but because a need to still have normalcy, And so they create a sort of like a they reject the reality of the situation a little bit.
Denial. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Right. Like the denial. Right. And like, it made me really have to kind of reckon with like, so here's a similar thing, right? Like, um, very politicized issue, just like transgenderism is now, right? People who I don't fundamentally agree with rationally in regard to the situation of COVID. And yet at the same time, that evening allowed me to understand the perspective that some of those people hold and why they hold it, and why there's a sort of denial, but that the denial also serves a purpose and a function, and like that's the part,
Yeah,
like
and
there's
you don't have to say that they're denial is reasonable, acceptable, that they're right, but you can
Right,
acknowledge that there is a rhyme and reason to their denial.
right.
Yeah,
And
and that's key to just not even finding a compromise, but finding understanding and
yeah,
being and finding a world in which we could coexist. And I'm not saying that certain people with certain beliefs, I think should not, should not be, what's the word? Tolerated. Some people should not be tolerated. But if we want to move forward as a society, I think that we need to try to understand the people who we disagree with most.
yeah, yeah. Try to find those points. Yep, absolutely, man. Like and it's not it's not like you said, it's not necessary that we have to agree. It's that just even for that moment, um, to just breathe that air, right?
Right.
Just let that be something that, like, you know, you don't have to, it doesn't make you that thing, right? Like, um
It doesn't make you a Trump supporter, just to put like a real world example out there. It doesn't make you a Trump supporter to understand the perspective of a person who supports Trump.
right, yeah.
And you don't
And it's
have to agree with them, but you can seek to understand why they would be a Trump supporter and replace the same sentences I just said with
whoever.
Biden or anything and everything. And you could learn about another perspective without necessarily prescribing or subscribing to it.
So then, like, I guess the question is, how do we give people that on ramp, right? Like, um, why can't we do that now? Why were we doing that better 20 years ago than we're doing it now? You know, um, like, no one's ever going to be
I mean,
society's.
it's probably just as simple as echo chambers,
Yeah,
and things that we are, despite the availability of information, we are feeding us um, self-validating information instead of challenging concepts that we hold to be true. And through challenging them, you would either validate that and or find a slight mistake and adjust your understanding slightly. But yeah, I think people just don't want to be challenged in general. I mean, I don't want to be challenged, but what I found most challenging was sitting by myself and ruminating over a lot of the topics that we talked about today and feeling conflicted within myself and not having an opportunity to have a conversation like this. Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. We have work to do as a society,
Yeah.
you know?
And as creatives,
Yeah,
because yeah, I mean, like using my example before, that project that solicited such a visceral and uninformed response that I've been working on is a way that I specifically try to peel back the layers of people who I don't agree with and think about various perspectives on any given topic. And I think that exploring these hard issues through creativity, through storytelling, is a way that we can come to some realizations collectively. And, hopefully watch Star Trek, watch whatever, people from different parts of the country with different belief systems, and hopefully uh, use those stories as a lens through which we recalibrate ourselves and assess ourselves, and hopefully we have the ability to correct our mistakes, take ownership of something, and not be stubborn to hold on to old beliefs when we have found them to be wrong.
You know, in our parents and our grandparents, a younger adulthood. Not long ago, there's this whole thing about like you don't talk about religion and politics at the dinner table, right? um, and there's kind of a reason for it, and I think also something that happened during that point in time is that a lot of people had a lot more associates and friends that shared viewpoints that were different than theirs, and that similar to how we were talking about characters with the lens of characters in a story, um, you might have a coworker who has a very different political or religious beliefs than you. You don't bring that up in the workplace. However, some of those personality and personal differences manifest in a way that made us have to also at the same time learn to work with those people and then even find connections with those people, right? And that we didn't use the shield or the front of the tribalism of politics and religion as we're using it in this current society. And that, in not letting that be the first barrier, the first and second barriers of how we interact with people, that we kind of had to perhaps learn to connect in a different way that didn't require being, my team is team Democrat and your team is team Republican, or what, you know what I mean? So as such, we found connections with people because we didn't wear our tribalism as a badge. That was something that was personal.
Right.
And I don't know. That's just an anecdotal.
Yeah, and even if somebody was branded as something that was, totally opposite of the brand that you had, religion-wise or political affiliation, you're able to transcend that because you have to. And I think people are trying to create a world in which not only are they siloed in their online communities and the information they receive, but also with whom they interact. And that's probably lending itself to further escalation of the polarization of inability of people
Sure.
and willingness of people to interact with others who don't hold the same beliefs. It's weird. You mentioned being from Miami, and the area I grew up in, New York, was similarly diverse. And I've always, like you were kind of speaking notes from my own diary, that something I pride myself on is coming from a diverse neighborhood and benefiting from that diversity. And I always took pride in growing up in the US as a melting pot, and always saw it as a melting pot. And that was a word, I don't know if it was like educational word of the decade in the 90s, but the term melting pot was used widely to describe us as a country.
Yeah.
And like, that's the US for me. That's part of
Yeah.
my identity as an American. And that is not just on the more superficial side of color and race and the visual things that we present, but also the cultures
Yeah.
and the ideas and the religions and yeah, I certainly hope that as civilization continues to evolve, that artists and storytellers and comedians and creative people of all likes are able to continue to explore ideas. And because I think that's where great cultural innovation happens, and where real self-discovery happens as we as a society try to maintain pace with technology. And right now
Yeah.
it seems like the technology is kind of getting away from us and, leading to some of the polarization. But man, I really do hope creative minds like yourself and like other people who I've interviewed over the course of What's Your Random so far continue to explore these boundaries, work together, and yeah, bring people who seemingly should not be together back together.
Yeah, man.
I don't.
Yeah, well, when you were talking about, like, I had this flashback to something that I remember really, really vividly. Was like when I was maybe 20 or 21, I was in Miami. My very good friend had been dating a girl who was from India, and well, now they're married and they have kids, but there are not a lot of Indians, or I didn't think there were a lot of Indians in South Florida, you know? And she invited us, me and my girlfriend at the time, and her boyfriend, to go with her to this Indian cultural event that was going to happen at an auditorium at the University of Miami. And I was, certainly happy to go. Like, I'd never been to anything like that. And, I was sure, like, let's go see, let's go check it out. And we went that night, and it was a shock because it was a big auditorium, and we walk in and the place is dark. We're a little bit late. And I look around and I realize this is the audience, and there's maybe 10,000 plus people, and everyone is Indian. And we're in the middle of Miami. And then, like, there's suddenly, like, Indian dance and music, and people are getting excited. And it was very Indian, like, not a lot of non-Indians in the room, right? And just, like, it was a powerful moment of, like, even though I already grew up, like, feeling, like, proud of diversity and whatnot, like, whoa, here's something totally culturally outside of the realm of, like, my experience up to this point in time, something that I didn't even think was possible. And now I'm in a world of this right now. Wow, and, like,
Yeah.
that was a moment that, like, to me, that's like what you're saying about being the melting pot of America, the beautiful melting pot of America, right? Like, please let those people be there. Please let them express the joy of their culture. Please allow them to welcome others who are not of their culture into that room. Allow them to experience the joy of their culture. Allow them to be inspired from that moment. You know what I mean? Like, those are the parts that, like, that's the
and then
inverse.
allow you as a non-Indian to learn about and participate and even adopt. That's part that's, I think, lost a little bit, is like the adoption. There is no American culture that existed 500 years ago, because it didn't exist. Like, we're making it, we're doing it right here now, baby. Like, this is the moment, and the moment is constantly now. It's going to be now tomorrow. It's going to be a now a year from now. And we're constantly evolving as a culture. And if we don't accept that and allow for that, then we will cease to be America. And I think part of what you're saying is, like, Miami, I thought it was diverse. That, wow, a level of diversity that I didn't
even see
coming. And I think we need to be open to that. And I mean, I'm open to that for all types of diversity. And I'm open to learning about different types of people, of all genders, all nationalities, all religions. And I just hope that we could all come together again.
Yep.
Cool. Well, I think, there's a lot more that we could probably dive into. So you might have to be a reoccurring guest if you're open to it.
Sure. If you welcome me, then I would be happy to.
Yeah. I was coming into this conversation anticipating reminiscing and being very nostalgic about you being in Japan and me not being there, because
we didn't cover Japan.
I know
barely,
we didn't cover it at all. And I do want to also talk about animation at some point, because it seems
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
you have some perspective on that as well. So, but probably for now, 3:15 in,
Yeah,
call it a show.
I think that that's appropriate. Yes.
You might have some work to do and some projects to tackle today.
I got some emails and things that are in the inbox.
Well, sorry for keeping you on so
No,
long,
no,
but
no, please. Thank you.
yeah, it was awesome having you. Matthew Moss, where can people find you, and what do you want them to see of yours? Because you have a lot going on.
I would say please go to my website, touchstudio.com. And then
Newly launched, right? And you have a lot of your latest work up there that you've done for clients, and it is
yeah, that's
the
really
work.
my portfolio site, but from there it leads out to all my social media and everything. So
Yeah, and I'll also link in the show notes to your project with Luis, if you don't mind, because I think
oh,
people
absolutely,
listening
yes,
might
and
want to jump
definitely
on that.
that's one to check out. 66 Days, a journal of the early stages of the pandemic and how it affects creative people
Awesome.
and the
And
collaborative process.
yeah, and I think it's a perfect story about that. And I'm certainly enjoying it. So, well, man, it was a pleasure. It was a blast. And
Thank you so
until
much.
next time,
Yes.
enjoy your random.
Thank you.
That's
You
the
too.
sign
Enjoy
off.
your random, everyone.
Everyone, enjoy your random, and get out there and be creative. Welcome, my fellow randoms, to the post-show debriefing, where I talk about key takeaways and areas where I think I could perform better and improve the podcast moving forward. Today was a really interesting and a little bit of a challenging episode. You probably sense some hesitation on my part, and I want to talk about that. Matt and I explored areas of abstract creativity, ideas about ideas, essentially. And we also explored some contemporary events that are impacting culture and society. And I struggle a lot of times when I am put on the spot to discuss such topics. I certainly have evolving opinions on all matters, as everyone, I believe, does. But oftentimes I find myself in a position where I'm second guessing the sentences that I'm constructing in my head, because I fear that my words may betray me and that my intentions may not be fault proof, meaning that somebody may take what I say out of context. Perhaps it's a little bit of paranoia on my part, but I have seen it before. At the same time, I don't want that to prevent me from doing what I want to do, which is having long-form discussions and challenging myself, challenging my own preconceived notions over the course of discussion and dialogue, exploring ideas and concepts that I have not yet explored on my own, and digging in so deep that I can fundamentally change the way that I think about things, the values that I hold. And I think that one of the reasons I started this podcast is because on the onset, I found that I had a severe lack in the amount of communication I was having with other people, even before COVID, but certainly made worse by the pandemic restrictions that we're currently under and not meeting people all that much out and about. But even before COVID, I think that the world had escaped me, and I'm not great at participating in short form dialogue and conversation. And I think that's in part because I really see a lot of nuance to any and everything. I like to analyze things for what they are and what they might be, and maybe find a potential negative reading in something, but also hopefully come away with a potential positive reading of the same exact idea, concept, post, whatever. But yeah, I wanted to do this podcast because I wanted to have long form discussions like the one I had with Matt. And I think I benefited from it in the end, that we were able to talk through some ideas and things that were troubling us and challenging us as creative individuals. But at the same time, it's not an easy conversation to have because I know that my own words can be dissected. And the point of me sharing all of this, other than to give a deeper understanding of why I'm doing a podcast, is to also clarify my intent, which is to use creativity, use dialogue, use interpersonal communication as a means to better understand one another, even if we don't always agree on everything. I don't think we have to agree on everything. You don't have to agree with me. I don't have to agree with you. But I think that there is room for deeper understanding. I think we could peel back the layers of intention and what people say and why they say it and the beliefs that they have and why they have those beliefs. I don't think we need to agree fundamentally with each other all of the time, but I think that we can seek to understand why certain people think in ways that are different from the way that we as individuals think. And that's my own personal perspective, and that's something that I want to bring into conversations like these when we do go deeper and do veer off a creative conversation into a more contemporary political discussion. And I wanted to avoid that at first, but at the same time, it's really important that these are the things that are on people's minds, whether they are creative or not. And creativity oftentimes explores these very ideas. So how can I avoid it, right? But what I want to try my best to do is to explore the ideas without passing judgment, explore my own ideas, challenge my own ideas so that I can have growth as an individual and my own perspective can grow, but also that I can grow to better understand people with whom I disagree. And maybe my words are betraying me even now. It's something I worry about and I hesitate with, but I did think of maybe a small anecdote that can help illustrate what I want to impart in this specific post-show wrap-up and key takeaways. I went for a run and I was thinking about what I thought about my conversation with Matt and if I was comfortable with it. And inevitably I am. This is a long form discussion. This is where we deconstruct our own ideas and our own ways of thinking. And I'm really grateful that I had this opportunity with Matt, and I certainly hope that I have similar opportunities in the future. So I went for a run and I was thinking about these things and trying to formulate a way that I could articulate my main takeaway from this show. And for me, the theme of presuming and assuming the intent of another without actually maybe listening to what they're saying is the biggest one for me. I want to be open to somebody who I don't agree with saying something that is right. I want to give them the flexibility to change. I want to give them the flexibility that I don't agree with them in one area, but there's potential that we could compromise and or agree in other areas. And the best way that I could articulate that is to say, I don't think that the devil is just in the details. I think there's also heaven and humanity in the details. If we take something somebody says with whom we do not agree, oftentimes we hear that before they even say anything. We're looking at ways to disagree, to invalidate what they're saying. We're looking for the devil behind what they're saying, the nuance, the pessimistic nuance of whatever they're trying to convey, instead of giving them a blank slate, or even better yet, looking optimistically, hoping that that there's some humanity, some heaven in the details. Maybe it's a stupid example, but I think it illustrates what I was trying to get at with my conversation with Matt, and my key takeaway from this episode is that let's not assume the worst of everybody, even if we've come to expect it. And I say that because I also hope that you come and approach things that I say that maybe rub you the wrong way, and realize that I have a very loving intent by the way that I'm looking at things. And long form dialogue is important. And one way to participate in dialogue is to create, to share your ideas through creative expression. So I ask you to go out there and do what you want to do, create what you want to create, send those messages into the universe, and share them with others. We're looking forward to seeing what you create. And if any of the guests interviewed here on What's Your Random have given you any tidbits that helped you along the way in that process, we're in it together. I really sincerely hope that you get out there and create, enjoy your random, and enjoy the random of others around you.